Welcome, friends. Come on in, get comfortable, whether you're curled up under a blanket, lying in bed with the lights dim, or just winding down from a long, long day. Whatever corner of the world you're in right now, I am glad you are here. Tonight, we are stepping back, way back, into a world that looks very different from the one you live in, and yet in some ways feels uncomfortably familiar. Here is something that will stay with you. In the year 1455 in England, a 12-year-old girl was handed to a man she barely knew. She was small descriptions from the time say she was slight, underdeveloped, still very much a child in both body and spirit. The man was 25 years old. He was twice her age, and the moment she said her vows, she was no longer just a girl with a name and a future that was her own. She became a wife. And everything that word meant in the medieval world, every restriction, every obligation, every silent terror closed around her, like a door swinging shut. Her name was Margaret Beaufort, and by the time she was 13 years old, she was a widow 7 months pregnant, alone in a castle in Wales, with a civil war raging outside the walls and a body that the birth nearly killed. That baby she carried became Henry VII, the first king of the Tudor dynasty, and Margaret. She went on to become one of the most powerful women in English history, not because the world gave her anything, but because she found ways to survive every single thing it took from her. Her story is extraordinary, but what makes it haunting is that it was not unusual, not really. Tonight we begin a journey through one of the most misunderstood corners of medieval life, marriage. Specifically what marriage meant for the women who lived through it. Not the fairy tales, not the romance novels set in castles, not the Hollywood version where the hero sweeps in at the last moment. The real thing, the legal thing, the quiet, daily, sometimes brutal thing. And I want to be honest with you from the start, this is not a simple story. It is not all dark and terrible. It is not all romantic and lovely either. The truth, as history tends to be, is far more layered, far more human, and honestly far more interesting than either extreme. So, let us begin at the very beginning, before the wedding, before the vows, before the ring. Let us begin with a girl who had no idea what was coming. In the medieval world, and when I say medieval, I mean roughly the 500 years between the 5th century and the 15th century, across Western Europe, childhood as we understand it today simply did not exist in the same way. There was no such thing as a protected, unhurried period of growing up where a girl could just be a girl. From the moment a female child was born into a family of any standing whatsoever, she was an asset. She was a future contract. She was, in the most literal sense, a piece of currency in a world where power moved through bloodlines, land, and strategic alliances. This is not me being dramatic. This is the documented reality. For families of the nobility, the lords, the earls, the kings, a daughter's value was calculated almost immediately. What land did she stand to inherit? What bloodline did she carry? What alliances could her marriage seal? Who needed to be pacified, rewarded, or bound to the family? These were the questions that determined who she would marry when she would marry, and whether she had any say in the matter at all. The answer to that last question, by the way, is more complicated than you might expect, and we will get there. But first, how young are we talking? The Catholic Church, which governed marriage law across virtually all of Western Europe during this period, set what it called the age of consent for marriage. For girls that age was 12, for boys it was 14. These were the minimums, the floor, not the ceiling. And they were based on the Church's understanding of when puberty began, which the theologians of the time considered the threshold for readiness. Let that sink in for a moment. 12 years old. Now, to be fair, and I think we have to be fair to history, even when it makes us uncomfortable, the Church did not simply endorse child marriage without any caveats. There was a distinction, at least in theory, between betrothal and consummation. A girl could be formally promised in marriage years before she was 12, but the marriage was not supposed to be consummated, meaning the physical relationship was not supposed to begin until both parties had reached the age of consent. In practice, as you might imagine, this distinction was not always honoured, especially when money and inheritance were involved. Margaret Beaufort's story is the clearest example of what happened when it was not. She was born in 1443, the daughter of John Beaufort, the Duke of Somerset. Her father died when she was barely a year old, possibly by his own hand after a failed military campaign brought him disgrace at court. So Margaret entered the world already carrying a weight. She was an heiress, a rich one, and that made her dangerous. In the medieval world, a wealthy heiress was not primarily a person. She was a resource. The moment her father died, the question was not, how do we take care of this child? The question was, who gets to control her lands and who gets to marry her? By the time she was around 3 years old, she had already been contracted in a marriage of convenience to a boy named John de la Pole, the son of a powerful duke who wanted access to her estates. They were children. They had no idea what was happening. The marriage was, as historians delicately describe it, a marriage of words only, meaning it existed on paper, not in any meaningful human sense. That first arrangement was eventually dissolved. But the pattern had been set. Margaret Beaufort was a chess piece on a board where she never held any of the other pieces. When she was 9 years old, she was summoned to court, and King Henry VI himself, a frail, mentally unstable king who desperately needed to secure his dynasty, had a new plan for her. He told her she needed to marry again. He gave her 2 options. She could marry her former child husband, or she could marry Edmund Tudor, his own half-brother. And here is the small, strange, quietly remarkable part of this story: the king actually let her choose. He probably did not mean it as any great act of feminist generosity. He was likely humouring a 9-year-old to make the whole process go more smoothly. But Margaret took it seriously. She asked for a night to pray and think it over. She prayed. She considered. And the next morning she told the king she would marry Edmund Tudor. She was 9. She thought she was making a choice, and maybe in the narrowest possible sense she was. But the shape of that choice, the limits of it, tells you everything about what medieval marriage meant for a girl born into any world of consequence. So, November the 1st, 1455, Margaret Beaufort, 12 years old, was married to Edmund Tudor, 25 years old, at Bletsoe Castle, the home she had grown up in. He was more than twice her age. Historically, most noble families understood, even if they did not always enforce the principle, that a young bride should not be expected to live as a wife in the fullest sense until she was at least 14, if not older. Her body was simply not ready. Medicine at the time, such as it was, had some awareness of this. Even church law, with all its insistence on wifely duty, acknowledged that pregnancy in a very young girl was dangerous. Edmund Tudor did not wait. Historians have grappled with how to describe what followed. Some are diplomatic about it, others are not. What we know is that within months of the wedding, Margaret was pregnant. She was 12, possibly just barely 13. Her body was described by contemporaries as small and slight. She was not ready. Edmund was then captured by Yorkist forces during the Wars of the Roses. He was imprisoned at Carmarthen Castle, and while he was there he died of plague, according to most accounts, in November 1456. Margaret was 13 years old. She was 7 months pregnant. She was a widow. She was alone in Wales, far from her mother, far from anything familiar in the middle of a civil war. She made her way to Pembroke Castle, under the protection of Edmund's brother Jasper Tudor, a man who from all accounts was genuinely kind to her, in a way her husband had not always been. And on January the 28th, 1457, on a freezing winter night, Margaret Beaufort gave birth to a son. The birth nearly killed her. She was as those who wrote about her described so little of personage, such a small frame that both she and the baby were not expected to survive. She did survive, so did he. But the damage to her body was permanent. She never carried another child to term in any of her 3 subsequent marriages. 50 years later, when her own granddaughter was to be married, Margaret wrote with urgency that the girl's husband must wait, that he must not injure her and endanger her health by proceeding too quickly. She was writing from memory, from her own body's memory. That baby born on a cold January night in 1457 became Henry VII, King of England, first of the Tudors. Now, Margaret's story is extraordinary because of what she went on to do, the political manoeuvring, the alliances she built, the dynasty she essentially single-handedly engineered. We will not go deep into all of that tonight because this series is not just about Margaret. It is about every woman who lived within this same system, the rules, the expectations, the walls. But her story matters as our opening window because it is documented. We have the letters, the court records, the chronicles, and those records let us see with unusual clarity what the system looked like from the inside. And here is what strikes me most every time I read about her. The system was not designed to protect her. It was designed to use her. And yet she navigated it. She bent it. She outlasted it. That tension between the constraints placed on women and the extraordinary ways some women found to exist within and around those constraints is going to run through every part of this series. Now you might be sitting there thinking, okay, but Margaret was nobility. She was one of the wealthiest girls in England. Surely ordinary girls, peasant girls, had a very different experience. Yes and no. The details changed based on social class dramatically. So, a peasant girl was not being married off to seal a political alliance or inherit a dukedom. But she was still subject to rules she did not write, and pressures she did not choose. For the peasant class, marriage had its own set of gatekeepers. Lords of the manor held authority over their serfs, and that authority extended to marriage. A female serf who wanted to marry had to ask permission from her lord, and she had to pay a fee for that permission. It was called merchet. The logic behind it was simple and cold. A serf who married might move away, might have her children belong to a different lord's estate, and so the lord was owed compensation for the loss of a worker and her future offspring. She was in the most literal sense financially valued as a producer of children. For peasant girls, marriage also tended to come a bit later than for the nobility, typically in the late teens to early 20s. Not because the world was suddenly kinder to them, but because a poor family had less to gain from rushing the transaction, and a young girl's labour was still useful to her parents before she left. This meant that, paradoxically, some peasant marriages were entered into with slightly more practical equality. The couple knew each other. They worked in the same fields. They had something closer to a mutual assessment of each other's usefulness as a life partner. That does not mean love was guaranteed or that power was equal. It was not. But it was a different texture of constraint. The one thing that was universal across every class was this. A girl grew up in a world that was already making decisions about her future before she was old enough to understand what the future was. And here is the thing I want to leave you with as we close this first part of our journey. There is a very human instinct when we look back at history to feel pity for these women and then move on, to say, thank goodness things are different now, and close the book. But I think Margaret Beaufort deserves more than pity, and so does every other woman we will meet in this series, because within a system that treated them as assets, as contracts, as tools of inheritance, they thought, they felt. They loved and grieved and strategized and endured and sometimes quietly triumphed. Margaret did not just survive that cold night in Pembroke Castle. She spent the next 30 years of her life working with extraordinary patience and intelligence to put her son on the throne of England. She did not do it because the world gave her the tools. She did it with whatever the world had left her after taking almost everything else. That is not a story about helplessness. That is a story about what a person can do when the only move available is forward. In a moment we're going to talk about money. Because underneath every medieval marriage, underneath the vows and the ceremony and whatever fragile emotion might have existed, there was a transaction, a financial negotiation so complex it could take months. And the currency being exchanged more often than not was a woman's entire inheritance, her right to land and the legal control of everything she would ever own. It is a story that is going to surprise you, because the system was more elaborate and more revealing about how medieval society truly understood women than almost anything else we could examine. Stay with me. So, now that you know how a girl entered the medieval world of marriage young with very little say, and often with a great deal of weight already on her shoulders before she ever spoke a vow, let us talk about what happened the moment that marriage was actually being arranged. Because here is the thing nobody tells you in the history books. Before any two people in the medieval world walked down an aisle or more accurately stood in a church doorway, there were weeks, sometimes months of something that looked a lot less like romance and a lot more like a business merger. There were meetings, there were documents, there were men sitting across tables from each other, sometimes with lawyers, sometimes with priests, sometimes both going through line by line what each family would give, what each family would receive, and what the woman standing at the centre of it all was actually worth. And the answer to that last question, it was remarkably specific. Let us start with the dowry, because almost everyone has heard the word and almost nobody fully understands what it actually meant. A dowry was not a gift to the bride. I want to say that again because it is such a common misunderstanding. A dowry was not given to the woman. It was given with the woman. It passed from her family, her father, her guardian, whoever held authority over her, directly into the hands of her husband. Think of it as the price of admission. The bride's family was in effect paying the groom to take their daughter, and in exchange the groom gained control of everything she brought with her. Land, money, livestock, household goods, sometimes entire estates, the woman herself. She walked through that transfer like a parcel attached to the contents. Now I know that sounds brutal, and it was. But it also had an internal logic that medieval society took very seriously. Marriage in this world was not primarily about two people building a life together. It was about two families combining resources and obligations. It was a legal contract with enormous consequences for inheritance, for land control, for political power. The dowry was the bride's family's contribution to that contract. In wealthy households, dowry negotiations could last for months and involve some of the most complex financial planning of the medieval era. Historians who have studied surviving marriage contracts from England and France describe them as resembling something close to modern property law agreements. Every asset was catalogued, every contingency was discussed. What happens if she dies before he does? What if he dies first? What if there are no children? What if there are too many children? Nothing, at least in theory, was left to chance. And this is where the second piece of the puzzle comes in, the piece that is much less talked about, the dower. If the dowry was what the bride's family paid out, the dower was the husband's obligation back. At the moment of the marriage, often literally at the church door in front of witnesses, the groom was required to formally declare what property he was setting aside for his wife in the event of his death. In English common law, this came to be standardized at 1/3 of the husband's lands. Not a gift, not a courtesy, a legal right. If the husband died, the widow was entitled to 1/3 of everything he had held during their marriage for the rest of her own life. This mattered enormously, because in a world where women could not work in most professions, could not hold most public offices, and had very few independent means of support, the dower was quite literally the difference between survival and destitution. Here is the part I find genuinely fascinating. The dower was not just a passive protection. It was also a form of leverage before the marriage even began. If a man's family wanted a bride with a large dowry, they had to offer an attractive dower in return. The father of the bride would sit across from the father of the groom, or in the case of royal marriages, ambassadors and legal teams, and the negotiation would go something like this: your family gets this much land and these assets. In return, your son must set aside these properties for our daughter, and she must hold them uncontested for her lifetime. It was in its own strange way one of the few moments in a woman's life when her interests were being actively bargained for. Not by her, she was rarely in the room, but on her behalf. And the outcome of that bargaining determined whether she would live in security or poverty if her husband died first. Now can we talk about Eleanor of Aquitaine for a moment? Because there is no better illustration of what a dowry could mean and what it could do to a woman's life than her story. Eleanor was born around 1122. Her father was William X, Duke of Aquitaine, ruler of one of the wealthiest, most culturally vibrant regions in all of France. Aquitaine was not just land, it was power. It controlled vast wine-producing regions, major trade routes, and the loyalty of countless noble families. It was in the estimation of contemporaries more or less the jewel of Western Europe, and Eleanor was the heir to all of it. Her father died when she was around 15. In that single moment, Eleanor became the most desirable marriage prospect on the continent. Every king, every duke, every ambitious nobleman who had even a passing awareness of geography understood what her dowry represented. The French king Louis VI, known as Louis the Fat, which does not seem particularly diplomatic, but there we are, moved faster than anyone. He arranged the marriage of Eleanor to his son, the young prince, who would become Louis VII within 40 days of her father's death. 40 days. The negotiations that secured the future Queen of France happened in barely more than a month. Eleanor's dowry was Aquitaine itself, the entire duchy, Poitou as well. She walked into that marriage bringing more territory than most kings held in their own names. And here is the extraordinary, almost painful irony: all of that land passed immediately into the control of her husband. Eleanor, who had inherited this vast domain, who had been its duchess in her own right, who knew its people and its politics and its particular character better than anyone, became legally unable to exercise direct authority over it the moment she said her vows. The land was hers by birth, but the marriage made it his by law. Their marriage lasted 15 years. It was not by most accounts a happy one, though happiness was never really the point. They went on the Second Crusade together, which was a catastrophic military failure. They disagreed constantly on matters of governance. They had 2 daughters but no sons, which was in the diplomatic language of the time a problem. And then Louis did something that many medieval noblemen might have considered deeply unwise. He agreed to an annulment. The official reason was consanguinity, the claim that Eleanor and Louis were too closely related by blood for the marriage to be valid under church law. The actual reason was a great deal more complicated, and probably involved the genuine breakdown of their relationship and the pressure of producing a male heir. The annulment was granted in 1152. Eleanor walked away from that marriage with her lands returned to her. That was the deal. Aquitaine came back to her personal control the moment the marriage ended, and Eleanor, free for perhaps the first time in her adult life, moved with extraordinary speed. Within 2 months of her annulment from the King of France, she married again. Her new husband was Henry the Count of Anjou, a man 11 years younger than her, brilliant and ruthless, who would soon become Henry II, King of England. With that second marriage, Eleanor's dowry Aquitaine transferred once again, this time to the English crown, and the consequences of that transfer echoed through European politics for literally 300 years. Aquitaine remained technically and contentiously English territory until the end of the 100 Years' War in 1453. Think about that for a moment. One woman's dowry, one marriage negotiation, and the border dispute it created lasted 3 centuries. Now pause and ask yourself something, and I genuinely mean this as a question worth sitting with. Does this seem entirely different from the world you live in? Because on the surface, yes, obviously. Women today are not delivered with their property attached. Marriage is not a financial contract requiring documented land transfer at the church door. But the underlying question, what is a woman worth, and who controls the answer, that question did not disappear. It just changed its costume. It became salary gaps, inheritance patterns, credit histories, the default assumption that a woman's assets become household assets in a way that a man's often do not. The medieval dowry system was extreme in its openness. It said the quiet part loudly. And sometimes I think the loudness of it is actually useful, because it lets us see the logic underneath the assumption that a woman's value was transactional, that her assets were transferable, that her worth could be negotiated by people other than herself with unusual clarity. Let me bring us back down from the royal level, though. Because Eleanor of Aquitaine is extraordinary precisely because of the scale. Most women's stories played out in the much smaller, much quieter space of ordinary dowry transactions. A farmer's daughter might bring a cow and a small plot of land. A merchant's daughter might bring a sum of money and a set of household goods. Even a woman with very little brought something, because arriving empty-handed reflected on the honour of her family. Historians who have studied English manor records from the 13th and 14th centuries have found accounts of dowry negotiations involving things like a single sheep, a wooden chest, a loom, a season's worth of grain. These were not political transactions. They were the careful, anxious calculations of families doing the very best they could to set their daughter up for a life that once married she could not easily leave. And in every single one of those transactions, large or small, the same essential structure held. The bride was the centre of the negotiation, and the least powerful person in the room. She did not write the contract. She did not hold the land after the contract was signed. She did not get to walk away if the terms did not suit her. What she got if the negotiation went well was a dower she could someday rely on. A guaranteed third of her husband's estate sitting in the future like a promise conditional on his death, conditional on her outliving him, conditional on no one contesting her rights after he was gone. It was in every sense a life built on contingency. There is one more layer to this financial architecture that I think is worth spending a moment on, because it is genuinely strange and a little heartbreaking when you understand it fully. The dowry a woman brought into a marriage was not hers to manage. It belonged to her husband. But, and this is the strange part, if the marriage ended or if he died, the dowry was supposed to return to her family. Not to her, to her family. So a woman could spend 15 years in a marriage funded partly by assets her own father had assembled, for her assets listed in the marriage contract under her name, and have no personal access to them for the duration of that marriage, and then if the marriage ended, watch them go back to the family she left rather than remain in her hands. She was in the most technical sense a conduit, a legal channel through which assets moved from one family of men to another family of men with a brief stop in the household she ran but never fully owned. And yet she ran that household. She managed its accounts, its staff, its stores, its relationships with the wider community. She made 1,000 small decisions every day that kept the whole structure functioning. She was in effect the operating system of the medieval household, indispensable, constantly running and almost entirely invisible in the official record. We're going to spend a lot of time in this series looking at what happened inside those households, at the daily texture of married life for medieval women, the work, the relationships, the negotiations that took place, not in legal documents, but over dinner tables and in quiet rooms. But first, we need to understand something that might be the single most surprising fact about medieval marriage law, something that cuts directly against the image of absolute control and rigid arrangement. Because here is what most people do not know under the law of the Catholic Church, which governed marriage across the entirety of Western Europe. During this period, there was one thing, one specific precise thing, that no father, no king, no lord, no amount of money could legally provide without the woman's involvement. Her consent. What that meant in practice, and the enormous, complicated, sometimes heartbreaking gap between what it meant in theory and what it meant in lived reality, that is exactly where we are heading next. Right, so we left off with a promise, and I want to honour it because it is genuinely one of the most surprising things I've ever come across in medieval history. We talked about the money, the dowries, the negotiations, the extraordinary financial architecture that surrounded a medieval marriage, and at the very end I mentioned that underneath all of it, underneath the contracts and the land transfers and the fathers sitting across tables from each other, there was one element of marriage that no amount of money could fully replace: consent. And I meant it when I said it would surprise you. Because the story of what consent meant in the medieval world, how it worked, who it protected, and what happened when people figured out how to use it, is not the story most people expect. It is honestly a little bit like finding out that the most controlling, rigid institution you can imagine accidentally created the world's greatest loophole. Let us go back to the 12th century. Around the year 1140, a monk and legal scholar named Gratian, working in Bologna, Italy, produced a document that would reshape the legal landscape of Western Europe. It was called the Decretum, an enormous, ambitious attempt to collect and harmonize centuries of contradictory church law into a single coherent framework. And in the middle of this vast legal text, Gratian turned to marriage, and he asked what seems like a simple question: what actually makes a marriage, not what makes it beautiful, not what makes it legitimate in the eyes of the community, what makes it legally, spiritually, unbreakably real. His answer was radical for its time, and it had consequences that rippled through European society for the next 300 years. Consent, Gratian argued, is what makes marriage, not the dowry, not the ceremony, not the priest, not the parents, not the lord of the manor or the king or anyone else. He wrote, and these words were copied, debated, and built upon by legal scholars across Europe, that no woman should be married against her free will. He went further: those who are to be of one body, he said, ought also to be of one spirit, and therefore no woman who is unwilling ought ever to be joined to anyone. Let me be clear about what this meant in context. This was not a revolutionary pamphlet distributed by reformers in the streets. This was canon law, the official legal doctrine of the Catholic Church, written by a legal scholar whose work became required reading in every major university in Europe. In the eyes of the Church, if a woman did not genuinely consent, she was not married. Full stop. Now, before you get too comfortable with that, I want to be very clear about two things. First, the gap between what the Church declared in law and what actually happened in practice was often enormous. A woman could technically refuse, but the social, economic, and physical consequences of refusing could be devastating. We will get to that. Second, the way consent worked in practice was far stranger, far more anarchic, and honestly far more interesting than you might imagine. Because the thing about declaring that consent alone makes marriage is that it immediately raises a question nobody in 1140 had fully thought through. If all you need is two people to say yes to each other, what happens when they say it in secret? This is where medieval marriage law gets genuinely wonderfully complicated. By the 12th century, the official church position built on Gratian's framework and refined by Peter Lombard, the Bishop of Paris, who added the crucial detail about words spoken in the present tense, was essentially this: if two people of legal age stood face to face and said to each other in present tense words, "I take you as my husband, and I take you as my wife," they were married. No priest required, no witnesses required, no church building required, no parents, no ceremony, no banns read aloud on 3 consecutive Sundays, no feast, no documentation, just 2 people, 2 sentences spoken aloud, and according to the highest legal authority in Western Europe, that was an indissoluble, permanent, valid marriage. Peter Lombard even made the distinction more precise because medieval canon lawyers loved nothing more than a very specific technicality. He explained the difference between verba de futuro words of the future tense meaning a promise to marry, and verba de presenti words of the present tense meaning, I am marrying you right now. The first was a betrothal, the second was a marriage, and the difference between saying I will take you versus I take you was legally the difference between a promise and a fait accompli. I take you, 2 words, and nothing on earth could undo it. You can probably already see where this is going, and yes, people noticed, almost immediately. The ecclesiastical courts of England, France, the Low Countries, and across Western Europe began filling up with cases, hundreds of them, thousands of them over the following centuries, cases in which someone claimed a secret marriage had taken place, cases in which someone denied it, cases where a woman came to court saying a man had promised her marriage and then walked away, cases where a man tried to escape a public marriage to a woman he did not want by claiming he was already secretly married to someone else. Historians who have studied the records of the ecclesiastical court at York, one of the largest surviving collections of medieval marriage litigation in England, have found case after case involving what were called clandestine marriages, secret marriages, marriages made in gardens, in bedrooms, at the sides of roads, in taverns, under trees, couples married in all of these places and more. And because the law said 2 present tense sentences were enough, the church was required to take these cases seriously. Think about what this actually meant for a woman, and I want to be careful here because the implications cut in 2 directions at once. On one hand, this was a form of protection. A woman who genuinely wanted to marry a man her family disapproved of had in theory a tool. She could simply say the words, in private without witnesses if necessary, with the man she chose, and legally she was married. Her family could scream, her lord could object, her father could disinherit her, but the marriage was valid under church law. This actually happened. Documented cases exist. Women who eloped, women who made secret vows, women who then appeared before church courts and argued with some success that their marriage was real and must be honoured. Joan of Acre, the daughter of King Edward I of England, secretly married Ralph de Monthermer, a squire in her own household, a man far below her in rank after the death of her first husband. When her father found out, he was, as one chronicler diplomatically put it, not amused. He had Ralph imprisoned. But Edward eventually had to accept the marriage because it had been validly contracted. His own daughter had used the system against him. Catherine of Valois, the widow of King Henry V of England, secretly married a Welshman named Owen Tudor, a man of far lower station whom she loved rather than remain a widow, subject to restrictions on her remarriage. That secret marriage, contracted quietly, and without any of the ceremony her status would have demanded, ultimately produced a line of descendants that included the entire Tudor dynasty. In both cases, a woman, a choice, 2 sentences, and a system that, however, reluctantly had to honour it, but now the other direction. And this is where I want you to sit with some discomfort, because the same law that protected women who wanted to make secret choices also made them vulnerable in a way that is difficult to fully absorb. If all you needed were two people saying "I take you" in present tense words and no witnesses were required, then a man could claim a woman had consented to marry him privately with no witnesses, and she had almost no way to definitively disprove it. All he had to say was, "She said the words. It was just the two of us." And if she was alone with him at the time, if there had been any intimacy between them, if anyone could be found to testify that they had been seen together, the court was forced to at least consider the possibility that a marriage had taken place. Historians studying these cases have found women who came to ecclesiastical courts insisting they had never agreed to marry the man claiming them as his wife, and some of them won their cases, but many did not. Because in a legal framework built on the premise that two private words created a permanent bond, and in a world where a woman's word against a man's word was already an uphill battle, the same legal structure that gave women one kind of freedom could also be used as a trap. Now, I want to tell you about a case that illustrates all of this better than any abstract legal principle ever could. And it is a case that changed the course of English history. The year is 1464. England is in the middle of the Wars of the Roses, the bitter, bloody civil conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York. And the young Yorkist king Edward IV is 22 years old, recently crowned, and supposed to be negotiating a diplomatic marriage to a French princess that will cement England's alliances abroad. Instead, he secretly married a widow named Elizabeth Woodville. Now the secrecy of this was itself scandalous. A king marrying without the knowledge of his council, without diplomatic negotiation, without any of the public ceremony that royal marriages demanded, this alone caused an uproar. But it was by the Church's definition entirely valid. They said the words, they consummated the marriage. Done. Here is where it gets truly extraordinary. Years later, after Edward had died and his young son was about to be crowned Edward V, a bishop named Robert Stillington came forward with a claim. He said he had evidence that Edward IV had previously, before his marriage to Elizabeth, made a secret marriage contract with another woman, a noblewoman named Eleanor Butler, daughter of the Earl of Shrewsbury. If that prior secret marriage had taken place, and Stillington claimed he had personally witnessed the exchange of vows, then Edward IV had been a bigamist. His marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was not just irregular, it was invalid, and their children, including the young boy about to be crowned king, were illegitimate. Parliament accepted the claim. The two young princes were declared illegitimate, and Edward's brother Richard took the throne as Richard III. Eleanor Butler had died in 1468, years before any of this became public. She could not testify. She could not deny it or confirm it. She was simply gone. And in her absence, the memory of two people speaking private words in a room somewhere had the power to reshape the English succession. Whether Stillington's testimony was true, whether that secret marriage had actually occurred, or whether it was a political fabrication used to justify Richard's seizure of power, historians have argued about for more than 500 years. It remains one of the great unanswered questions of English medieval history. But here is what the story tells us, regardless of the answer in a system where two words spoken in private constituted a permanent marriage. The stakes of secrecy were almost unimaginably high. For everyone, including kings, there is something I find genuinely moving about all of this if you stay with it long enough. The Church, in trying to protect women from forced marriages, created a law that said consent was everything. The heart was the seat of the will. No one could force a yes. And that principle, however imperfectly enforced, however easily abused, was a remarkable thing to enshrine in law in the 12th century. It was not feminism, it was theology, but it had feminist consequences, at least in flashes. A girl who found her way to a church court and said clearly without wavering that she had never consented, sometimes she won. Sometimes the law worked, and the fact that it sometimes worked in a world structured almost entirely against women's legal autonomy is worth sitting with for a moment. Of course, the reason it did not work more often brings us to a harder truth. Because consent in the medieval world existed on a spectrum, and at the darker end of that spectrum was the uncomfortable reality that pressure, family pressure, social pressure, fear of poverty, fear of worse, could shape a woman's yes in ways that made it very hard to call it freely given. What the law said, and what the human experience actually felt like, were often two entirely different things. That gap between the letter of the law and the lived reality of women inside medieval marriages is something we're going to sit inside for a while as this story continues. Because right now we have talked about how women entered marriage, we have talked about the money surrounding it and the surprising legal principle at its heart, but we have not yet talked about what happened the moment the ceremony was over. The moment the words were spoken and the vows were made and the feast was eaten and the guests went home, the moment a woman crossed a threshold and became in the eyes of the law something she had not been the day before, what that transformation actually meant, what it cost, what it erased, and what in certain very specific circumstances a woman could still hold on to, is exactly what comes next. Picture this moment. A woman stands in a doorway. Behind her, her family's house, her name, her legal self, everything she has been for however many years she has lived. In front of her, her husband's home, her husband's name, her husband's world. She steps across that threshold, and in the eyes of English common law, the woman who walked in no longer exists. This is not a metaphor. This is not me being dramatic for effect. This is what the law actually said. From the 13th century onward, when a woman married under English common law, she underwent what legal historians have called, with striking precision, a kind of civil death. Her separate legal identity did not diminish. It did not shrink. It was absorbed, swallowed whole into the legal person of her husband. The doctrine had a name. It was called coverture, and the name tells you everything. She was covered, hidden, folded inside him like a letter sealed in an envelope. The outside bore his name. She was the contents real, present, essential, but invisible to anyone who was not prepared to open the seal. The legal scholar Henry de Bracton, writing in the 13th century in what became one of the most influential legal treatises in English history, put it plainly. Husband and wife, he wrote, were a single person, one flesh, one blood. The legal personality of the wife became merged in that of the husband. She took his name. She was in the words that would be echoed down through centuries of English law, no longer a legal entity. The French term used in medieval English legal courts for a married woman was femme covert, literally a covered woman. The term for an unmarried woman or a widow was femme sole, a woman alone. And here is the extraordinary, almost darkly funny thing about those two designations. Femme sole, woman alone was actually the freer one. Being alone in the eyes of this legal system meant you existed. Being covered, being married, being protected by a husband, that meant you had legally disappeared. William Blackstone, the great English legal commentator writing in the 1760s, crystallized this idea in language that is worth sitting with for a moment. He wrote that upon marriage, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended, not restricted, not limited, suspended, like a breath held, like a clock stopped. And then he added the line that has been quoted by historians, lawyers, and everyone who has ever studied this subject because it captures the logic of the whole thing with such devastating tidiness. By marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. And that one person, that singular, unified legal entity, is the husband. As a later American jurist put it even more bluntly, though the husband and wife are one, the one is the husband. Now, let me tell you specifically what this meant. not in abstract legal terms, but in the actual daily practical texture of a woman's life once she was married. She could not own property, not in her own name. Anything she brought into the marriage land, money, jewels, household goods. The dress she was wearing on her wedding day became upon marriage legally the property of her husband. He could sell it. He could give it away. He could gamble it if he chose. She had no independent claim to any of it. She could not sign a contract. She could not enter into any legal agreement on her own behalf because she had no legal self to bind. If she wanted to buy something, sell something, make any kind of formal arrangement, her husband's involvement, his authority, his signature was required. She could not sue. She could not appear before a court as an independent party. If she had been wronged, if someone had cheated her, damaged her property, broken a promise to her, she could not bring a case. Her husband brought it on their behalf because legally it was his injury. And she could not write a will. A married woman making a will was, from the perspective of common law, something close to a legal impossibility because everything she might wish to leave to someone had already been transferred to her husband the moment she said her vows. She had nothing in her own name to bequeath. Historians studying probate records from medieval England have found that the number of wills made by married women drops off sharply compared to those made by widows who had re-entered feme sole status and regained the legal ability to own and dispose of property. Think about what that means in human terms. A woman could live for 30 or 40 years as a wife, managing a household, raising children, conducting all the daily business of a complex domestic life, and not be able to write down what she wanted to happen to her possessions after she died. Because legally she did not have possessions. She had never had possessions, not since the day she married. There is a detail in this that I keep coming back to because I find it particularly illuminating. Under English coverture, even the clothes on a woman's back, the gown she wore, the jewellery she kept in a small box, the personal items of everyday life, technically belonged to her husband. Some legal commentators of the period noted that a wife might have a kind of customary claim over her own clothing and personal ornaments. Bracton himself mentioned that a wife could be said to have something of her own in the items given to her for personal adornment. But this was a courtesy, not a right. It existed in practice, not in law, and the distinction between practice and law, when a marriage went wrong, was everything. Now, does this mean that every medieval husband marched around demanding formal legal control over his wife's hairpins? Obviously not. Plenty of medieval marriages operated with genuine mutual cooperation with husbands who trusted their wives' judgment, and wives who exercised substantial practical authority within the household and beyond it. The letter of the law and the reality of daily life were often two very different things, and historians who have spent careers studying this period are careful to remind us that the gap between legal doctrine and lived experience was real and significant. But here is the problem with that gap. The moment the practice diverged from the law, the moment things went wrong, the moment trust broke down, the moment a husband died and his heirs disputed what his widow was owed, the law is what won. The practice disappeared. The letter of coverture remained. And it is in those moments, the contested moments, the crisis moments, that you see what the system actually was. Let me give you a human example that illustrates this with unusual clarity. Sometime in the late 14th century, a woman whose name appears in the records as Joan, a widow who had been married 3 times, which was not unusual given the mortality rates of the period, found herself in a legal battle that consumed years of her life. Her 3rd husband had died, and the property she believed was rightfully hers, property she had brought into that marriage, property she had managed and maintained, was being claimed by others. She petitioned the king. She fought in courts. She documented her case with letters and arguments that showed by any reasonable reading that she understood the law better than most men of her time, and she fought and she pushed and she partially won, not because the system was designed to help her, but because she was formidable enough and stubborn enough and legally literate enough to work the system from within. Her story is not unique. The records of equity courts and chancery courts, the courts that operated outside the strict common law and could take a somewhat more flexible approach, are full of women doing exactly this. Petitioning, arguing, finding the small spaces where the system could bend and pushing. But here is what always strikes me, the fact that it required this level of effort. The fact that a woman who was plainly in the right had to spend years fighting for what a man in the same situation would simply have had. The fact that working the system from within was itself a form of labour exhausting, costly, uncertain, that women were expected to perform, while also running households and raising children and managing estates. Now here is where the story becomes genuinely interesting in a different way, because coverture, as total as it sounds, was not actually uniformly applied, and the exceptions, the cracks in the doctrine, tell us something important about how medieval society actually functioned. The most significant exception was something called feme sole status in trade. In certain English towns, London being the most prominent example, married women who conducted business independently of their husbands could under local custom be legally recognised as acting as if they were single. They could sign contracts for their trade. They could sue and be sued in matters related to their business. They could conduct commerce with a legal identity. The logic was entirely practical. The London wool trade, the textile merchants, the market stalls, the medieval economy, especially in urban areas, depended on women being able to buy and sell. And a system in which every transaction a woman made was void because her husband had not personally authorised it would have been commercially catastrophic. So the law bent. In the specific limited context of trade, a married woman could exist as a legal person. This is something I find fascinating. The system was not completely rigid. It had pressure valves. And those pressure valves tell you what medieval society actually valued enough to protect not women's autonomy as a principle, but commerce. The economy needed women to function as traders, so the law made a space for them to do so. It was pragmatism masquerading as concession. There is another exception worth knowing, though it comes with a slight darkly comic edge. Under the common law doctrine of coverture, a wife's crimes were generally considered her husband's responsibility. The reasoning was the same unity of person logic if they were one person, and he was that person, then her actions were his actions and his liability was for her actions. The practical consequence of this was that a wife who committed a crime in the presence of her husband could sometimes argue in court that she had acted under his compulsion, that she was merely the instrument of his will, that because the law had already established her as legally subordinate to him, it was not unreasonable to presume that anything she did in his presence was something he had directed. This defence actually worked in some cases, not always, not reliably, but sometimes, which means, and I want to be precise about this, that the very doctrine designed to erase women's independent existence occasionally served as a bizarre form of legal shield. If you had no will of your own in law, how could you be held fully responsible for your actions? I am not suggesting this was anything resembling justice, but it is a reminder that complex systems produce unpredictable edges, and medieval women were often very skilled at finding those edges. I want to pause here and ask you something genuinely, and I mean this as a real question worth thinking about tonight as you drift off. We live in a world that has formally rejected all of this. In most countries, women have full and equal legal personhood, whether married or not. The doctrine of coverture was dismantled piece by piece through the 19th and 20th centuries, In England, the Married Women's Property Act of 1882 was the crucial turning point, the moment when married women were finally recognised as being able to own property in their own names. In the United States, some aspects of coverture survived in certain states into the 1960s. 1960s, not the 1360s, the 1960s, within living memory. And even now, even after the formal legal abolition of all of this, historians point to remnants: the cultural expectation that a woman takes her husband's name, the patterns in property wealth and financial independence that still follow gender lines in ways that are not entirely explained by individual choice, the social structures that, even without a law to enforce them, still carry some of the shape of the world that coverture built. I'm not saying the modern world is medieval. It is not. The change has been real and significant and hard-won by generations of people who refuse to accept it. But I think it is worth knowing where the shape of certain assumptions comes from. History does not just belong to the past. It lives in the bones of the present. What I find most remarkable about the women who navigated the world of coverture, medieval and early modern alike, is not that some of them suffered under it, though many did. It is that some of them, against remarkable odds, found ways to operate within it that gave them genuine agency. They knew the law, often better than the men around them expected. They made careful use of the equity courts. They negotiated marriage settlements that protected certain assets from coverture entirely. They ran businesses under feme sole status in trade. They built networks of allies and relationships that gave them informal authority the law refused to recognize. They were, in other words, extremely competent people doing extremely difficult things in a system that was not built for them. And that competence, that daily quiet, largely invisible labor of navigating a world designed around other people's convenience, is something I want us to carry into everything that follows. Because next we move into a part of this history that has been whispered about for centuries but rarely examined directly. We have talked about what happened to a woman legally when she married. Now we need to talk about what was expected of her body in the most intimate and specific terms the medieval church was prepared to legislate. And the rules were, I promise you, more detailed, more strange and more revealing about how medieval society understood marriage than almost anything else we've covered. Something I keep turning over in my mind, especially after everything we've been discussing. The money, the law, the vanishing legal self is a question that sounds simple, but is actually quite loaded. Did any of these women ever fall in love? And if they did, what on earth did they do with it? 'Cause here is the thing that often gets lost in the bigger structural story of medieval marriage. The human heart does not follow legal frameworks. It never has. And medieval people, despite the negotiations and the contracts and the doctrine of coverture, were still people. They felt things, they hoped, they pined, they loved, or at least something they called love. But love in the medieval world was a far stranger and more complicated creature than the one we know today. Let us start with what might be the most shocking truth about love and marriage in the medieval era. Not shocking because it is dark, but shocking because of how casually the medieval world accepted it as obvious. The church, which governed marriage and its purposes with extraordinary specificity, officially recognized two valid reasons to enter a marriage. 2. The first was to avoid the sin of sexual relations outside of marriage. In other words, to channel desire into something the church would tolerate. The second was to produce children. That was it. Those were the church's reasons. Neither one of them is love. In the 12th century, 3 more decent motives were added to the list: the reconciliation of enemies through a strategic union, financial gain, and beauty. And I want to pause on that for a moment, because beauty is the closest thing on that entire list to anything resembling an emotional pull toward another person. And it is fifth place behind avoiding sin, having children, making peace between warring families, and money. Love, genuine, freely chosen romantic love, was not on the list. Not because people were unaware of it, they absolutely were, but because the Church, which had spent considerable intellectual energy thinking about marriage, had collectively decided that love was not a reason to marry. It was at best something that might develop afterward. A bonus. A grace, if you were fortunate. Never a prerequisite. And for noble women, especially the women whose marriages carried the most political and financial weight, this was not a philosophical abstraction. It was the operating reality of their lives. And yet, at the exact same moment that the Church was listing the 5 acceptable reasons to marry, none of which included love, something else was happening in the courts of southern France that would change how Europeans thought about romantic feeling for the next 800 years. The troubadours were beginning to sing. The troubadours were poets and musicians, mostly of noble birth, who emerged in the courts of Aquitaine, Provence and Champagne in the late 11th and 12th centuries. They sang about love, but a very specific, very stylized kind of love. The French called it fin amour, which translates roughly as refined love. Later writers would call it courtly love. And the central feature of this love, the thing that defined the entire tradition, was this: it was almost never about marriage. The troubadour's beloved was typically a woman of higher status, often already married, who was idealized, worshipped from a respectful distance, and served with absolute devotion. The knight or poet suffering in her name was not supposed to possess her. He was supposed to pine for her, to improve himself in her honour, to become more virtuous, more courageous, more worthy, not in order to win her, but because loving her even hopelessly made him a better man. This was, if you think about it, a perfectly calibrated response to a world in which marriage and love operated in entirely separate spheres. Noble families married for power and land. Nobody expected the people involved to be in love. So where did all that human longing go? Into poetry, apparently. Into songs about suffering knights and inaccessible ladies, and love that was noble precisely because it could never be consummated. The troubadours essentially built an entire literary philosophy around the idea that the highest form of love was the kind you could never fully have, which is either very romantic or very convenient depending on how you look at it. Now, what did women think of all this? This is the question that almost nobody in the medieval period bothered to record systematically: the inner experience of the women who were simultaneously the objects of courtly love poetry and the subjects of arranged marriages and the legal non-entities of the common law. What did it feel like to be the lady on the pedestal, the married noblewoman being serenaded from a respectable distance, while also being the same person who had been handed to a husband for dynastic reasons and had no legal identity outside his name? We have one answer, and it comes from one of the most remarkable women of the entire medieval period, a woman whose story is, if I am being honest, one of my favourites in all of medieval history. Her name was Christine de Pizan. She was born in Venice in 1364, but grew up in Paris after her father, a physician and astrologer, was appointed to the French royal court. She was educated to an unusual degree for a woman of her time. Her father actively encouraged her studies even when her mother apparently thought the whole enterprise was unnecessary and that Christine should be learning to spin. In 1379, when she was 15 years old, her father arranged her marriage to a man named Etienne du Castel, a notary and royal secretary 9 years older than Christine, educated at the University of Paris. This was an arranged marriage in the most conventional sense. Christine did not choose Etienne, her father chose him for her, and then in one of those small quiet moments that history sometimes hands us, they fell in love. Not dramatically, not in the way the troubadours sang about. Not the aching, impossible love of the poetry that surrounded them at court. Something warmer and more ordinary and more real than that. Christine described their marriage in her own writing as genuinely happy. Etienne encouraged her studies. He supported her intellectual life. He was, in her own words, her true friend. They had 3 children together, and for 10 years Christine de Pizan was simply a married woman who loved her husband and was loved in return. She was 25 years old when Etienne died of plague in 1389 while travelling with the royal court. Christine was left with 3 children, a widowed mother, a niece to care for, and a web of lawsuits over her late husband's unpaid salary. She had no income, no male relatives in France, and no obvious means of supporting anyone. This system that had organised her entire life, the one in which her father found her a husband, and her husband provided for the family and her role was to manage the household and be a good wife, had collapsed, and the system offered her almost nothing. So Christine did what almost no woman of her time had done before. She started writing professionally, not as a hobby, not for pleasure, as a job. She wrote poems and ballads on commission for noble patrons. She wrote histories, political treatises, philosophical texts. By 1400 she had become the most celebrated writer in France, man or woman. She was offered positions at the courts of England and Milan, and turned them down because she loved Paris and did not want to leave. She wrote extensively about women, about the gap between how women were depicted in literature as fickle, weak, dangerous, morally questionable, and how women actually were in her observation, capable, intelligent, virtuous, often heroic. Her book, The City of Ladies, written in 1405, was a direct challenge to centuries of misogynist writing. She imagined a city built entirely of the stories of great women, biblical, historical, mythological, and invited her readers to consider what civilization owed to people it had systematically undervalued. And here is where she connects back to our theme, because Christine had very specific things to say about courtly love, and they are worth hearing. She thought it was in her characteristically direct way, largely a trap. In her writing, The Treasure of the City of Ladies, she warned women about the men who placed them on pedestals. A woman who accepted the courtly love devotion of an admirer, Christine argued, might feel flattered to be idealized, but the idealization was temporary. The moment the knight succeeded in any real intimacy, the moment the pedestal collapsed, she would be ruined. Her reputation would be gone. The man would move on, and she would be left with the consequences. Christine was not cynical about love itself. She knew what real love looked like. She had experienced it with Etienne. What she was cynical about was the use of romantic language as performance, as manipulation, as a cover for something that was really about men's desires and women's reputations being traded against each other. I find this observation remarkable for 1405. She was pointing at something genuinely subtle and genuinely true about the difference between love as it appeared in literature and love as it functioned in a woman's actual life. Now let me bring in a broader perspective here, because Christine's experience was exceptional in its detail, but not unique in its emotional shape. The question of whether love and marriage could coexist in the medieval world is not a simple one. Among the nobility, as we have discussed, marriage was primarily strategic. Love was not expected and often not present, at least not at the beginning. But that does not mean it was always absent. What historians have found in reading the private letters, the wills, the personal documents of medieval married couples is something more nuanced than either all arranged marriages were loveless, or love was just like it is today. Many couples who began as strangers did over time develop genuine tenderness and partnership. Men left wills expressing profound grief at leaving their wives. Women spoke of husbands with evident feeling. The formal language of legal documents occasionally cracks open to reveal something human underneath. Among ordinary people, the peasant farmers, the tradespeople, the urban workers' marriage operated differently anyway. without land dynasties to protect and political alliances to cement. There was more room for individual inclination. Historians studying peasant marriage records have found that many couples in the medieval period seem to have known each other before marriage, to have lived in the same communities, to have made choices based at least partly on personal preference. The system still had its gatekeepers, the lord's permission for serfs, the parents' negotiation of terms. But the emotional texture was often closer to what we might recognize as two people deciding they wanted to build a life together. And then there is this question that I think is worth asking directly: is love in arranged marriage inherently compromised? I do not think the answer is yes. I think the medieval world proves that love, real lasting transformative love, can grow in conditions that look from the outside nothing like its ideal environment. Christine de Pizan and Etienne du Castel did not choose each other. And yet by every account we have what grew between them in 10 years of marriage was the real thing. What I find moving about Christine's story is not just the love but what she did after it ended. She picked up the pieces in a system that had no interest in supporting her, and she made something extraordinary out of them. She turned her grief into work, her work into influence, her influence into a defense of every woman who had been underestimated by the world she lived in. She became a writer because she had no other choice, and she became one of the great voices of medieval Europe because she was, as it turned out, astonishingly good at it. If that is not a story about the unexpected power that grows in constrained lives, I do not know what is. There is one more layer to this that I want to sit with for just a moment before we move on. We have talked about love within marriage and love outside of marriage through the courtly love tradition and the gap between them. But there is a category of feeling that medieval people experienced in marriage that does not fit neatly into either category. Something that might be called companionship or partnership, or the quiet accumulation of shared life. In the historical records you find traces of it everywhere once you know to look. A husband who writes in his will that he wants his wife to manage his estate because she knows it better than anyone. A woman who travels hundreds of miles to negotiate on behalf of her imprisoned husband because she is the one who understands the law well enough to argue it. A couple who, according to the records, took every long journey together when it would have been easier for him to go alone. These are not dramatic love stories. They do not read like troubadour poetry. But they are something real and something durable that marriage, even when it began without love, could sometimes produce. The medieval world was not a romantic world by the modern definition, but it was absolutely a human one. And human beings placed in proximity, given shared purpose, tested by the same difficulties, they build bonds, they rely on each other, they grow attached in ways that can be difficult to distinguish from the inside from love. What comes next is a harder question though, because we have been talking largely about what marriage could be at its most functional, most human, most livable. But the history of marriage for women in the medieval period also includes its shadow side, the experiences that were not about love or partnership, or even functional negotiation, but about the much darker possibilities that a system with so little protection for women could produce. The medieval church had rules about that too, and those rules, what was permitted, what was forbidden, and what happened when the line between the two was crossed, tell a story that is more complicated and more important than most people realize. That is where we are headed next. There is a category of historical fact that when you first encounter it makes you stop and read the sentence twice. Not because it is gruesome or tragic, though some of what we're about to discuss carries real weight, but because it is so specific, so matter-of-fact, so thoroughly documented, that it forces you to confront just how completely the medieval church inserted itself into every corner of a married woman's life, including, and I say this with full awareness that we're in polite bedtime story territory, the bedroom. So, deep breath. let us talk about what the Church had to say about the intimate lives of married couples, because it had a great deal to say, and some of it is so extraordinarily detailed that I genuinely could not make it up. To understand this part of medieval marriage, you have to understand something about how the Catholic Church of this period understood the human body and its appetites. The Church was, to put it gently, deeply suspicious of pleasure. Not just sexual pleasure, pleasure in general. The idea that a person might do something purely because it felt good with no higher purpose attached was viewed with theological unease. Sex in particular occupied a strange and uncomfortable position in church teaching. On one hand, the Church had definitively declared marriage a sacrament, a holy institution reflecting divine love. On the other hand, the physical act at the centre of that institution was associated in the writings of enormously influential theologians like St. Augustine of Hippo, and later Thomas Aquinas, with the messy, uncontrollable nature of human desire. The body's appetites were exactly the sort of thing a good Christian was supposed to be working to transcend. And so, the Church arrived at a position that managed to be simultaneously permissive and extraordinarily restrictive. Sex within marriage was acceptable, indeed necessary, but only when approached with the right intentions at the right times and in the right manner. Any deviation from these conditions introduced sin into what was supposed to be a holy act. What followed from this position was a set of rules so specific, so granular, so deeply embedded in the daily rhythm of medieval life, that they amounted to an entire theology of the marital bed. Let us start with the question of when. The medieval Church maintained a religious calendar full of what were called chaste days periods, during which married couples were expected to abstain from relations entirely. These were not vague suggestions. They were, at least in the earlier medieval period, treated as genuine obligations. The 6 weeks of Lent, the 40-day fast before Easter, were a period of complete abstinence. The season of Advent, the 4 weeks before Christmas, similarly demanded continence. Major feast days throughout the year were off limits. Sundays, the Lord's Day, were to be kept holy, which meant in the stricter interpretation free from the carnal distraction of marital relations. Some penitential traditions also excluded Saturdays, Thursdays, and Fridays from permissible activity. And then on top of the calendar restrictions, a wife was expected to abstain during menstruation, which medieval medicine regarded with considerable alarm, considering it somehow toxic or ritually contaminating. Abstinence was also required during pregnancy, and for 40 days after the birth of a son, or 66 days after the birth of a daughter. I will let you sit with that discrepancy for a moment. 66 days for a daughter, 33 for a son. The penitential of Cummian and early medieval texts specified these numbers precisely. Because apparently the degree of post-birth ritual impurity a woman had was directly related to the gender of the child she had just delivered. If you add up the days excluded by all of these various restrictions, historians have calculated that a strictly observant medieval couple, one following all the rules, would have had sexual access to each other for fewer than 180 days per year, roughly half the year or less, and often considerably less depending on the individual calendar of feast days. And this was inside marriage, the only context in which the Church considered any of this acceptable at all. Now, and this is the part where it gets genuinely strange. At the exact same time the Church was imposing all of these restrictions, it was also insisting on something called the conjugal debt. The conjugal debt was a concept rooted in the writing of the Apostle Paul, who had argued in his letter to the Corinthians that husbands and wives owed each other their bodies. Neither partner Paul wrote had authority over their own body independently, each belonged to the other. From this theological foundation, medieval canon lawyers built an elaborate doctrine. Each spouse was obligated to be sexually available to the other upon request. To refuse without a legitimate reason was not merely unkind. It was, in the Church's view, a violation of a sacred obligation. It was a sin. And here is where it becomes genuinely interesting from the perspective of a women's history, because the conjugal debt was in its theoretical formulation entirely mutual. It applied equally to husbands and wives. Medieval theologians and canonists were actually quite explicit about this. The obligation of the conjugal debt was one of the very few areas of medieval law in which women were declared to have equal standing with men. A wife had the right to request the conjugal debt from her husband, and he was obligated to render it. He could not simply refuse. He could not claim he was tired or uninterested or had already fulfilled the obligation earlier that week. If she asked, he was required to respond. This sounds on the surface like a remarkable form of protection, and in a limited sense it was. There are documented cases in ecclesiastical courts of women bringing complaints that their husbands had refused to fulfill the conjugal debt, and having those complaints taken seriously by church authorities. But here is where I want to invite you to think carefully, because the reality of this equality was considerably more complicated than it appeared. Thomas Aquinas, writing in the 13th century, grappled with precisely this question. In his Summa Theologiae, he concluded that while the conjugal debt applied in principle to both spouses, the practical expression of it was not symmetric. He noted that a husband was expected to be attentive to his wife's unexpressed desires, to watch for indirect signs that she might want intimacy, but was too modest to ask directly. Men were expected to be forthright in seeking marital relations, while women, given their natural modesty, might need their desire to be perceived and responded to rather than stated aloud. This is already operating on some fairly troubling assumptions about what natural modesty means and who gets to define it, but it went further. Other moralists of the period added additional complications that limited a wife's practical access to the conjugal debt. If a husband had already rendered the debt once and was exhausted, the wife was not permitted to request it a second time. If she did, she was, in the language of one commentary, behaving like a prostitute. Let me be precise about what this means. A wife who requested intimacy from her own husband, after he'd already satisfied the obligation, once was characterized using the most demeaning language available. The equality of the conjugal debt in practice consistently bent toward the husband's convenience. Women's sexual needs were acknowledged in theory. In practice, they were hedged, qualified, and frequently subordinated to assumptions about feminine passivity and male prerogative. There was also the question of what the sex was for. The Church's position, maintained with considerable firmness throughout the medieval period, was that the only fully acceptable purpose of marital intimacy was procreation. A husband and wife who engaged in marital relations for any other reason, pleasure, affection, simply because they wanted to, were committing at minimum a venial sin. The act might be technically licit, occurring within marriage, but the motivation coloured it. Thomas Aquinas put it in terms that are, depending on your perspective, either admirably logical or deeply unsettling. A man who was excessively passionate toward his own wife was treating her as he would a prostitute. The implication being that desire itself, desire directed at your own spouse in your own marriage, was a form of moral failure if it was not properly ordered toward procreation. Saint Jerome, writing in the 4th century, had put it even more boldly: a man who is too passionately in love with his wife is an adulterer. These words were repeated, quoted, built upon for centuries. They shaped the framework within which medieval people were supposed to understand their own intimate lives. They were taught in sermons. They were asked about in confession. They were part of the moral atmosphere in which every married woman, whether she was a noble countess or a farmer's wife, was expected to understand her own body and its place in her marriage. Now, I want to be genuinely fair here, because history is not served by oversimplification. First, most historians who have studied this period believe that the vast majority of ordinary medieval people simply ignored these rules. The Church's extraordinary specificity about what was and was not permitted suggests an institution that was repeatedly confronting the gap between its expectations and actual human behaviour. You do not write detailed penitential guidelines about every conceivable variation of marital sin if everyone is following the basic framework. The rules are elaborate precisely because people were not following them. Second, by the 12th century the Church itself was softening its position. The stricter penitentials of the early medieval period, with their lists of forbidden days and detailed calculations of when sex was and was not permitted, gradually gave way to a more pastoral approach. The Church began to frame its expectations about holy days as strongly encouraged recommendations rather than absolute commands. The framework relaxed even if the underlying theology did not fully resolve its contradictions. Third, alongside the restrictive theology, there ran a counter-tradition in medical writing in popular literature in the secular culture of the time that took a far more relaxed and sometimes celebratory view of marital intimacy. Medieval literature is actually full of frank, often comic, occasionally rather explicit treatments of the subject that bear little resemblance to the Church's official position. People have always been people. What I find genuinely worth sitting with, though, is what the existence of these rules reveals about how the medieval Church conceived of women within marriage. At every level of this framework, the restrictions on when the doctrine of the conjugal debt, the insistence on procreation as the only legitimate purpose, women occupied a deeply ambiguous position. On one hand, they were declared to have equal rights within the conjugal relationship. On the other hand, those rights were consistently interpreted qualified and applied in ways that centered male experience and male convenience. Their own desires were acknowledged, and then immediately characterized as shameful if expressed too directly. Their bodies were subject to cycles of ritual impurity that the Church's rules reflected with detailed precision. Their role in the intimate life of their marriage was simultaneously important, essential even, and almost completely outside their own control. A woman did not choose when she could have relations with her husband. The calendar chose. The Church chose. The husband's state of exhaustion chose. The question of whether she had given birth to a son or a daughter chose. She was once again the person at the centre of something she did not design and could not fully direct. And yet, and this is the observation that keeps bringing me back to this period, medieval women were not passive. They were not simply accepting recipients of whatever the system dictated. The evidence from church court records, from medical texts, from private correspondence and household accounts suggest women who were actively navigating all of this, who were pushing back where they could, claiming the conjugal debt when it served their interests, using the Church's own framework to argue for their rights in contested situations. The system was not built for them, but many of them learned to work it with considerable skill. Which brings us naturally to the question of what happened when the system broke down entirely, when the marriage itself became the source of the problem rather than the solution. When a woman found herself inside a marriage that was in various ways destroying her, and discovered that the same institution that had constructed the entire edifice of marriage law had also built a set of walls around it that made leaving almost impossible. The medieval Church had definitive views on divorce, and those views, the extreme difficulty of ending a marriage, the narrow paths through which a woman might legally seek relief, and the price she paid for attempting to use them, are some of the most revealing, and honestly, some of the most heartbreaking things we will encounter in this entire series. Let me tell you about a woman named Joan Wood. The year is 1519, London. A city of narrow streets, crowded alehouses, church bells, and the constant noise of a medieval metropolis going about its daily business. Joan is somewhere in the tangle of streets just north of London Bridge, when she sees her opportunity, a brief moment when she is not being watched, not being followed, not under the immediate eye of the man she's been living in terror of. She finds a parish beadle, one of the local officers charged with keeping the peace, and she says to him with whatever composure she can manage, "Yonder is my husband in the church, and I dare not go home for he will kill me." She asks the beadle to walk her to her daughter's house. It is in Bermondsey across the river to the southeast, not far in distance, but in a city where a woman could not simply leave her husband's house without his permission, and where returning to a violent spouse was the legal expectation, it might as well have been another country. The beadle Thomas West agreed to help, and they set off together. They did not get very far. Joan's husband intercepted them in the street. He pulled out a knife. Thomas West managed to disarm him, and the knife was later brought into court physical evidence in Joan's legal suit for separation as proof of what she'd been living with. Joan Wood's case survives in the records of the London Consistory Court. It is one of hundreds of documented stories from medieval England of women trying to escape marriages that were destroying them, and what those records reveal the specificity of them, the detail of individual lives preserved in legal Latin, while the women themselves had no voice in any other public record, is one of the most important and most harrowing parts of the entire history of medieval marriage. The medieval church, which had constructed the entire legal architecture of marriage, was also the institution responsible for governing what happened when that architecture failed, and its answer to the question of what a woman could do in a marriage that had become unbearable was deeply systematically inadequate. Divorce in the modern sense of a legal ending of a valid marriage that allowed both parties to remarry did not exist. The Church's position, based on its reading of Scripture, was that what God had joined together no human court could lawfully put asunder. A valid marriage was permanent. It ended at death, and not before. What the Church offered instead were two very different things, and it is worth understanding both clearly because they affected women in entirely different ways. The first was annulment, what medieval canon lawyers called the divorce from the bond of marriage, or in the Latin they preferred divortium a vinculo matrimoni. An annulment was not the ending of a marriage. It was a declaration that a valid marriage had never existed in the first place. This sounds like a fine distinction, but it had enormous practical consequences. An annulment wiped the slate clean. Both parties were free to remarry. The problem was that the grounds for annulment were extremely narrow. The marriage had to have been invalid from the beginning, typically because of coerced consent, because the parties were too closely related by blood, because one party had been previously married to someone else, or because the marriage had not been consummated due to physical incapacity. These grounds were sometimes used creatively. Consanguinity, the blood relationship prohibition, was the most commonly exploited. In the medieval period, the Church prohibited marriage between anyone related within 7 degrees, which in practice meant anyone who shared a common ancestor going back 7 generations. For the aristocracy who tended to intermarry within a relatively small pool of noble families, this meant that almost any two noble people could likely find some common ancestor if they looked hard enough. An unhappy marriage could sometimes be dissolved by the simple discovery, real or conveniently constructed, that the couple were distant cousins. The case of Lothair II, ruler of Lotharingia in the 9th century, is a particularly vivid illustration of how this worked, and more importantly of how it worked differently for men than for women. Lothair had been married to a woman named Teutberga. The marriage was childless, which was politically disastrous for a ruler who needed an heir. Lothair had a mistress, a woman named Valdrada, who had already borne him children. He wanted out of his marriage. He wanted to marry Valdrada instead. What followed was a protracted public and ultimately unsuccessful campaign spanning decades. Lothair accused Teutberga of the most serious charges he could construct. He assembled councils of bishops to hear his case. He pressured, manipulated, and exhausted every legal avenue available to him. And Teutberga, who had done nothing wrong, fought back at every step. She appealed to the Pope. She refused to go quietly. She persisted. Eventually, the Pope sided with Teutberga. Lothair did not get his divorce. He died before the situation was resolved, still married to a woman he had spent years trying to be rid of. Now here is the point I want to make about this case. Lothair was a king. He had access to bishops' councils, the ear of powerful churchmen across the continent. He had virtually unlimited resources to pursue his legal campaign. He had every structural advantage available to a medieval man of his rank, and he still could not force an annulment. For an ordinary woman with no political connections, no independent financial resources, and no legal identity separate from the husband she was trying to escape, the obstacles were proportionally enormous. Which brings us to the second option. The Church offered the separation from bed and board, or divortium a mensa et thoro in Latin. This was not a dissolution of the marriage. It was permission for the couple to live apart. They remained legally married. Neither party could remarry during the other's lifetime. But a woman granted this separation was allowed to establish her own household and live outside her husband's roof. The grounds for this were somewhat broader than for annulment. The most commonly cited were adultery, heresy, or cruelty, what the Church called sevitia, in its legal Latin a word meaning severity or brutality. And this is where we return to Joan Wood and to Agnes Corb, and to the thousands of women whose names appear in the consistory court records of medieval England, because cruelty was in practice the ground on which almost all known separation cases were brought. But the threshold for what qualified as sufficient cruelty was extraordinarily high. The phrase that appears repeatedly in the legal records in the standard Latin formula used in these cases translates roughly as, "She does not dare to cohabit with her husband." She does not dare, not that she is unhappy, not that he has been unkind, but that the level of physical danger is such that her life is at genuine risk. Historians studying the records of the ecclesiastical province of York from the 14th to the early 16th centuries have identified only 6 identifiable applications for separation on grounds of cruelty, for an entire region over more than a century. 6. Not because violence was rare in medieval marriages, the records make clear it was not, but because the legal threshold was so high, the process so costly, and the outcome so uncertain that most women never got as far as a formal petition. And here is the layer that I find most devastating of all. Even when a woman managed to bring a case, even when she had witnesses, even when she had physical evidence, a knife brought into court by a sympathetic beadle, testimony from servants who had watched her husband's escalating violence, the church courts were not primarily interested in helping her escape. They were primarily interested in reconciling the couple. The institutional goal was the preservation of the marriage. The woman's safety was a secondary concern. The court might order the husband to post bonds guaranteeing his future good behaviour. It might reprimand him. In serious cases, it might finally grant the separation she sought. But the default, the preferred outcome, was always reconciliation. Go back, try again. Your soul and his are joined before God. What this meant in practice was that a woman petitioning for separation had to prove not merely that violence had occurred, but that the violence had been so extreme, so repeated, so escalating, that no hope of safe cohabitation remained. She had to paint a picture of her situation that left the court no reasonable option but to accept that returning her to that household was sentencing her to serious harm. And she had to do this without money, without independent legal standing, often without the ability to appear in court herself, except through a representative. And if the court decided her case had not met the threshold, she had to go home. There is another dimension to this that I think deserves direct attention, because it has been debated and sometimes misunderstood in popular history. The idea that medieval law allowed a husband to beat his wife within certain limits, specifically that he could use a stick no wider than his thumb, which gives us the phrase rule of thumb, is one of those historical claims that turns out to be more complicated than it sounds. The rule of thumb as a legal doctrine is actually contested by historians. Some researchers have found no consistent medieval legal text that specifies the thumb measurement as a formal rule, and others argue the phrase's etymology has nothing to do with domestic violence at all. What is documented clearly and consistently is the broader principle that a husband had the moral and legal authority to correct his wife through physical means, provided that correction was aimed at governance rather than cruelty, and provided it did not rise to the level of endangering her life. This is a distinction that functioned entirely differently depending on who was drawing the line. The Church's position was that correction within the household, including physical correction, was analogous to the authority of a father over a child or a master over an apprentice. It was considered a form of moral responsibility. A 15th century text, sometimes called the Rules of Marriage, exhorted the husband to stand as judge over his wife. When she committed an offence, he was first to admonish her sharply. If that failed, he might need to frighten her more forcefully. And if that still failed, the text suggests with a clarity that is difficult to read across 5 centuries a stick might be required, because it argues it is better to punish the body and correct the soul than to let the soul be corrupted through leniency. These ideas were not marginal. They were taught from pulpits. They were embedded in household manuals. They shaped the expectations that ordinary people, both men and women, brought to the institution of marriage, and yet, as with everything in this history, the reality was more complicated than the official position. Social disapproval of excessive violence toward wives was real and documented. When John Wright beat his wife Elizabeth in a neighbourhood alehouse in 1521, stripping her to her petticoat in front of witnesses the innkeeper told him to take her and leave, he did not intervene more forcefully than would have been to challenge a neighbour's authority over his own household, which carried its own social and legal risks, but the act of expulsion was itself a statement. This was not acceptable public behaviour. Agnes Corb's servants witnessed her husband's violence and eventually testified to it in court. Joan Wood's neighbours knew what she was living with before she made her desperate walk with the beadle toward Bermondsey. The records suggest a community that had a rough, imperfect and consistently applied sense of where the line was. Governance was acceptable. What looked like hatred or uncontrolled rage, what appeared to cross from discipline into something darker, attracted intervention, gossip, community pressure. Not reliably, not in ways that protected women consistently, but the line existed in social practice even when the law drew it very differently. I want to sit with one more thing before we move on because it connects to everything we have been discussing and points towards something important. The women in these records, Joan Wood, Agnes Corb, the dozens of women whose names appear in the York Consistory court cases, and the London records were not passive. They were not simply enduring. They were doing something active, difficult, and often dangerous. They were using every resource available to them to change their situations. They found allies, beadles, sympathetic neighbours, servants willing to testify. They navigated legal systems that were not designed to help them. They abandoned their husbands informally and moved to new neighbourhoods when the formal legal process was inaccessible. They used the language the court required, the specific formula of "she does not dare to cohabit," because they understood that language was the tool they had. They were working the edges of the system they were trapped in with the skill and determination of people who had no other options and understood the stakes perfectly. This is not a story about helplessness. It is a story about constrained agency, about what people do when the structures around them are built against their interests and they act anyway. What strikes me deeply about this particular corner of medieval history is how far it reverberates forward. The idea that a woman needed to prove danger before she could be legally separated from a man harming her. The institutional preference for reconciliation over safety. The gap between what the law permitted as correction and what the community recognized as cruelty. These are not only medieval problems. They are problems that echoed in different forms through centuries that followed, and understanding where they came from, the specific theological and legal frameworks that built them matters, because nothing changes without first being named. Speaking of what was built and what endured, we have spent significant time now looking at the darker corners of medieval marriage. But the story of what marriage meant for women in this period is not only a story of constraint and harm, it is also a story of remarkable women who operated within this system in ways that gave them genuine power, who took what the world offered and turned it into something that commanded respect, influence, and sometimes genuine authority. The most unexpected source of that authority, and the one most people never think about when they imagine the medieval period, is also the one we're going to explore next. It involves grief and loss, and a strange kind of liberation that the system never quite intended to create. Grief is a strange doorway. In most times and most places in history, losing a husband was a catastrophe. A woman wept, mourned, dressed in black, and faced a world that had been structured around his presence, his name, his income, his legal identity, his decisions. Everything that had organized her life was suddenly absent, and yet in the medieval world in a twist that the system never quite intended. The death of a husband was also the moment a woman was handed something she had not held since before her wedding day, her own legal self. The moment a husband died, his widow stepped out from under the doctrine of coverture. She was no longer a feme coverter covered woman legally absorbed into someone else's identity. She became, in the language of medieval law, a feme soul again, a woman alone. And that phrase, which sounds lonely, actually carried extraordinary implications. She could own property. She could sign contracts. She could appear in court as an independent party sue and be sued in her own name, write a will, and decide what happened to everything she had accumulated. She could, and this was genuinely radical, make decisions without asking anyone's permission. For many medieval women, especially those who had spent decades carefully managing their husband's estate, while possessing no legal authority over it, this moment of grief was also simultaneously a moment of liberation, unlike anything they had ever experienced. Historians who study this period have noted the paradox so often that it has become something of a touchstone in medieval women's history. Widowhood was the most powerful legal status available to the vast majority of women in the medieval world. Not marriage, not birth, not rank or wealth or intelligence, widowhood. And once we understand why it becomes impossible to look at the medieval widow, that figure so often depicted in popular imagination, as a frail, grieving presence in black without entirely reconceiving her, let us start with the basics of what widowhood actually delivered legally and economically. We discussed the dower briefly earlier in this series, the 1/3 of a husband's land that a wife was legally entitled to receive upon his death for the rest of her own lifetime. The Magna Carta of 1215 had explicitly enshrined this right. No widow should be compelled to pay anything for her dower, nor should she be delayed in receiving it. These were among the first formal legal protections for women in English history, embedded in one of the foundational documents of Western law. 1/3 of everything her husband had held during their marriage, not a portion of what he left in his will, not what his heirs decided to give her out of generosity. 1/3 by legal right for life. In addition, a widow was entitled to remain in her husband's principal residence for 40 days after his death, what the law called her quarantine, while the legal and financial arrangements were being settled. In some urban settings, particularly London widows had even more generous protections, with the right to remain in the family home until they remarried or died, and then if the couple had established a jointure at the time of their marriage, those jointly held properties we discussed earlier in the context of marriage negotiations, the widow took full control of those as well, immediately upon death without contest. The total picture for a woman who had married well and outlived her husband could be remarkable. Margaret de Lacy, Countess of Lincoln, who was widowed in the 13th century, held control of 1/3 of the Lacy family lands and 1/3 of the Marshall estate simultaneously. She received whole counties as part of her dower settlement. When her eldest son died in 1258, she managed the entire estate until the younger heirs came of age. One woman controlling lands spread across multiple English counties, answering to no one. Then there is Margaret de Brotherton, whom historians sometimes describe as one of the most formidable widows of the 14th century. She had been married twice, first to John Lord Seagrave and then to Sir Walter Morney. Each marriage had brought its own dower and jointure. Each husband's death had added to the total, and Margaret, who combined longevity with considerable political ambition, watched those assets accumulate across decades. By the 1390s, the income from her landholdings had reached £3,000 per year. That is a sum that placed her among the wealthiest individuals in England, full stop, not the wealthiest women, the wealthiest individuals. She styled herself the Countess Marshall after one of the great historic offices of state. The Crown addressed her as Margaret Marshall. She wielded her wealth and connections with the focused intention of someone who had spent years watching power operate from the outside, and now had a chance to participate. She was in the most literal sense one of the most powerful people in the country. And she had reached that position through the specific legal mechanism that widowhood created, the accumulation of dower rights from successive marriages combined with the simple fact of outliving the men she had married. Now I want to be careful here, because the story of the powerful medieval widow has a shadow side that is equally important to understand. The legal freedoms that widowhood conferred were real, but they were not universally accessible, and they were not unchallenged. For a woman of wealth with established social connections and the means to fight for her rights in court, widowhood could indeed be transformative. But for women of more modest circumstances, the same moment that delivered legal freedom also delivered economic vulnerability. A farm widow whose husband had done most of the heavy physical labour, whose young children were too small to help, who owed rent to a lord and had no surplus to carry her through the winter, for her widowhood was not liberation. It was crisis. Historians studying medieval manor records have found that poor widows in the English countryside frequently remarried quickly, not from any emotional desire for companionship but from economic necessity. The household economy of a medieval farm required male labour to function, and a widow who could not provide it herself had to find someone who could. Remarriage was often the most rational available response to an essentially impossible situation, and even wealthy widows faced pressures that complicated the simple picture of freedom. The most common and most immediate was the pressure to remarry applied by lords, by family members, by the social expectation that a woman without a husband was an incomplete or potentially dangerous figure. Under the Anglo-Norman and early Angevin kings, widows of men who held land from the crown were explicitly in the gift of the king. This means exactly what it sounds like. The right to grant or withhold permission for a widow to remarry belonged to the monarch, and that right was treated as a form of property. Kings sold it. They rewarded loyal allies with it. An ambitious baron who wanted to add to his estates might pay the crown for the right to marry a specific widow, meaning the widow's hand in remarriage became a commodity that was bought and sold without any direct reference to her own preferences. The Magna Carta, which enshrined dower rights, also addressed this. It stated explicitly that a widow should not be compelled to marry if she wished to remain single, provided she paid a fee to the crown to purchase that freedom. She had to buy the right not to be sold again. Think about that for a moment. A woman outlived one husband. She gained legal freedom, financial independence, the ability to direct her own life for the first time. And then the system reached out and said, if you want to keep that freedom, you must pay for it. Your independence has a price tag. Some women paid it gladly, some could not afford to, and some were simply not given the option, finding themselves given in remarriage to men they did not choose before they had time to establish themselves in their new legal status. There is a particularly fascinating wrinkle in this story that I want to spend a moment on because it illuminates how complex the medieval widow's position really was. When a wealthy widow did choose to remarry of her own volition, to a man she selected, there was a category of contemporary opinion that viewed such a marriage with deep suspicion. The phrase that some medieval writers used for a widow who had married more than twice, or who had made a poor match, or who had used her wealth to marry a man of lower status, was startling in its directness, maritagium diabolicum, a devilish marriage. The concern was partly social. A widow who married down was considered to be misusing her position, degrading her family's standing. But there was also something else underneath it. A wealthy widow who remarried on her own terms had in some fundamental sense found a way to operate the system for her own benefit. She had accumulated property through successive marriages, held it during her widowhoods, and then deployed it strategically in a subsequent relationship of her own choosing. She was playing the game that men had always played, using the same rules and winning, and that apparently made people deeply uncomfortable. Let me introduce you to a woman whose story captures the daily texture of powerful widowhood in the medieval period more vividly than almost anyone else I've encountered. Her name was Alice de Bryne. She was a gentlewoman, not royal, not of the highest nobility, but solidly comfortable and well-connected, who lived at Acton Hall in Suffolk, England. She was widowed in 1386 and never remarried. She lived as a widow for nearly 50 years until her death in 1435. What makes Alice remarkable is not that she was a famous figure in her own time, she was not, but that she kept records. Extraordinarily detailed records. The household accounts she maintained between October 1412 and September 1413 have survived intact, and they offer a window into the life of a medieval widow that is genuinely unlike anything else in the historical record. Those accounts document everything, every meal served, every guest received, every quantity of grain, every piece of livestock, every expenditure of her substantial household. In a single year, hundreds of guests passed through Acton Hall. Alice negotiated marriages for her daughters, corresponded with King Richard II about the wardships of noble children being raised in her home, managed multiple estates spread across several counties, and appeared in court to enforce her legal rights against those who challenged them, including in one documented case having a man sent to debtor's prison for failing to pay what he owed her. She sent men to prison. She corresponded with kings. She ran a household that functioned as a social, economic and administrative hub for her region of England. And she did all of this while being legally categorized as a widow, a status that gave her the authority to act that marriage had withheld. The household account that survives from 1412 to 1413 is a single year. 50 years of Alice's widowhood are represented by this one surviving record. And even from this single year, historians have been able to reconstruct the full complexity of a life that was by any measure richly active, deliberately managed, and thoroughly autonomous. I think about women like Alice de Bryne when the broader narrative of medieval women's constraint threatens to become too simple. Because the constraint was real, we have spent hours of this series documenting it. But so was the agency, so was the competence, so was the life. The system created a structure in which a woman's legal personhood was suspended during marriage, but that same system also mandated that upon widowhood that personhood must be returned. The law had built in a reset, and the women who reached that reset point, who had spent years managing estates, learning law, navigating courts, building networks, all in the name of their husbands, suddenly found themselves doing exactly those same things in their own names. The skills had been developing all along. The authority had simply been withheld. And now I want to ask you something, because it strikes me as genuinely worth sitting with. If a woman could manage an estate, conduct legal cases, negotiate wardships, correspond with royalty, and run a household of hundreds of people, all of which Alice de Bryne demonstrably did, what exactly was the legal logic of coverture protecting against? What was the system preserving by insisting that these same abilities disappeared the moment a woman had a husband? The answer, I think, is not about capability at all. It was about control. The system was not designed around what women could or could not do. It was designed around what men could control. And widowhood was the crack in that design, the place where the logic broke down and the woman stepped through. What strikes me as the most poignant part of this entire picture is the timing. The freedom that medieval widowhood conferred often arrived at exactly the moment in a woman's life when she was least positioned to fully enjoy it. Middle-aged, grieving, responsible for young children or aging dependents, managing an estate that required constant attention, fighting off unwanted suitors, arguing with lawyers. The liberation was real, but it was also exhausting, and it came wrapped in loss, which is perhaps why the figure of the medieval widow in literature, Chaucer's Wife of Bath being the most famous example, is drawn with such complexity. She is funny and assertive and strategic and genuinely difficult. She's been married 5 times. She knows exactly what the system can offer, and she has extracted every bit of it. She's not meek, not grateful, not tragic. She is formidable. I suspect Chaucer drew her that way because he had actually watched women like this operate, because in the world he inhabited the powerful widow was not a fantasy. She was a recognized social type sufficiently familiar to be satirized, sufficiently common to resonate. We have now traced the arc of a medieval woman's relationship with marriage from beginning a girl betrothed, before she understood what marriage meant through the daily reality of life, inside a marriage governed by law, custom, church doctrine, and whatever humanity the particular people involved managed to bring to it. And then through widowhood, that strange hinge point where everything changed. But we have not yet looked at the women who occupied a completely different space in this picture. The women for whom marriage itself as an institution became a tool to be used, a weapon, to be wielded, a stage on which their own ambition and intelligence operated on the largest available scale, the medieval noblewoman operating at the highest political levels, using marriage not as something that happened to her, but as something she, with varying degrees of agency, deployed, and what it looked like when those women understood the game they were playing and played it extraordinarily well. Consider for a moment what a chessboard looked like to a medieval nobleman arranging his daughter's marriage. He saw territories, trade routes, alliances that could end a war or start one. He saw bloodlines converging, claims being reinforced, enemies being neutralized through the strategic placement of a daughter in the right household at the right moment. A marriage at the highest levels of medieval society was in the most literal and unsentimental sense an act of foreign policy, and the piece being moved across the board was a woman. What is extraordinary, what I keep returning to the more time I spend in this history, is not that women were used this way. It is that so many of them eventually figured out how to move themselves. The year is 1396. At a great pavilion set up near Calais on the border between English and French territory, One of the most unusual diplomatic events of the late medieval period is unfolding. The kings of England and France, Richard II and Charles VI, have met to seal a 28-year truce that will bring an end to decades of brutal conflict. The price of this peace, the living seal on the treaty, is being carried toward the English king in a litter draped with gold. She is 6 years old. Her name is Isabella of Valois. She's the eldest surviving daughter of the French king, a child who has been selected at 6 years old before she would have understood what any of this meant to become Queen of England. She is dressed in blue velvet embroidered with golden fleur-de-lis. She's wearing a diadem of gold and pearls. Her dolls have been packed into her trousseau alongside the jewels and the gold plate, because even the people arranging this marriage understood on some level that this was a child, not a diplomat. She was formally handed to Richard at a dinner, led in by ladies, presented to a man 22 years her senior, married in a ceremony 4 days later, a few days before her 7th birthday. On London Bridge, when the procession entered the city, crowds pushed so desperately to see their new queen that at least 9 people were crushed to death. Richard II appears by all accounts to have been genuinely kind to Isabella. He visited her at Windsor, where she was tutored and cared for. Contemporary descriptions compare their relationship to a father and an adopted daughter, rather than a husband and wife. He gave her gifts. He took care to make her comfortable. He told her he would let her come to Ireland soon when he left for a military campaign in 1399. He never came back. He was deposed, imprisoned, and died most likely of starvation at Pontefract Castle in 1400. Isabella was 10 years old, a widow, a political asset with no current patron. Henry IV, the new king, immediately began manoeuvring to marry her to his own son, the prince who would become Henry V. Isabella refused, loudly and publicly. She plunged her household into mourning, cursed Henry IV, and insisted on lamenting her dead husband until her position in England became untenable. It took her family 2 years of negotiation to extract her from England. She finally returned to France in 1401. She was eventually married again to her cousin Charles, who became Duke of Orleans. She cried throughout that ceremony too. She died in childbirth in 1409 at 19 years old. I want to stay with Isabella's story for a moment because it sits at the intersection of so many things we've been discussing throughout this series. She was used as a diplomatic token before she could form any coherent understanding of what was happening to her. She was kind of loved in the limited paternalistic way that a very young queen could be loved by a man who was essentially her guardian more than her husband. And then when the world around her collapsed, she demonstrated something that nobody who arranged her marriage had anticipated: a refusal. A 10-year-old girl inside a political system designed to move women like pieces across a board said no, loudly, repeatedly, at personal and political cost. She did not win. She never had real agency over what happened to her. She died at 19, still in service to arrangements made when she was a toddler. But that refusal, that loud, stubborn insistence on mourning the husband she had known as a kind figure, if not a real spouse, was not nothing. It was the only form of agency available to her, and she used it with everything she had. I find her story one of the most quietly devastating in all of medieval women's history. Not because it is uniquely terrible, but because it is ordinary at that level of society. This was simply what happened to royal daughters. Now let me show you a very different kind of woman operating within the same basic constraints, but with considerably more room to maneuver. The year is 1448, not in a royal pavilion in Calais, in a fortified manor house in Norfolk, England. And the woman at the centre of this story is not a princess. She is a gentlewoman, well off connected, but not royal, not of the great nobility. Her name is Margaret Paston. Margaret has a problem. Her husband John is in London, as he usually is. John Paston is a lawyer, and spends most of his time navigating the legal and political world of the capital, while Margaret runs everything else. And a local lord named Robert Hungerford, Lord Mullins, has decided to seize the Paston estate at Gresham. His forces, 1,000 men according to Margaret's account, are surrounding the manor house. Margaret Paston, in her 20s, pregnant or recently pregnant with a small household of 12 defenders, is running the defence. She writes to her husband. The letter survives. It is one of the most remarkable documents in all of English medieval history, partly because of what it contains and partly because of how it is written, with the brisk, organised clarity of someone who has assessed a situation and knows exactly what she needs. She requests crossbows. She requests windlasses to operate them. She requests poleaxes and bolts. She provides a specific account of the tactical situation, the state of the walls, the behaviour of the opposing forces. She describes exactly what resources she has and exactly what she lacks. And then in the same letter, almost as an afterthought, she asks John to send a pound of almonds, a pound of sugar, and some broadcloth for hoods for the children. Crossbows, bolts, poleaxes, and also could you pick up some almonds on your way home? Margaret Paston managed to hold Gresham for a time, but eventually the walls were broken down around her. She was evicted. The house was sacked. She wrote to John about all of this with the same measured, practical detail with which she had reported the initial siege. This was not the last time Margaret Paston defended Paston property under armed siege. In 1469, the Duke of Norfolk laid siege to Caister Castle, a far more significant property that the Pastons had acquired through a disputed inheritance from a wealthy knight named John Fastolf. Margaret and her younger son John III held the castle with 30 men for 2 months before they were forced to surrender. 2 months. 30 men against the forces of one of the most powerful nobles in England. Between these episodes, Margaret ran the estates, managed the tenants, oversaw the income-handled legal correspondence negotiated on behalf of the family, with local officials and with the court arranged marriages for her children, and wrote or dictated more than 100 letters that survive, making her the most prolific letter writer of the entire medieval period in England. Her husband's letters to her were typically lists of business instructions. Attend to this. Check on that. Make sure this has been done. He trusted her completely, not as a gesture of progressive sentiment, but because she was simply better at managing the affairs of the household than anyone else available, and everyone involved knew it. When John Paston died in 1466, Margaret continued the correspondence. She directed her sons, admonished them when they failed in their duties, praised them when they succeeded. She negotiated the marriages of her daughters with the same unsentimental practicality that had characterized her entire approach to life. When her daughter Margery secretly married the family bailiff Richard Calais, Margaret disowned her, not from cruelty but from the same clear-eyed assessment of family interest that had governed everything else she did. A daughter married to a bailiff was a disaster for the family's social position. Margaret understood the game had played it her whole life and did not excuse her daughter from its rules simply because love was involved. Margaret Paston is one of the figures in medieval history who I think most honestly represents what the daily reality of marriage meant for women of her class and her intelligence. She was operating inside a system designed by men for men's benefit, governed by rules she had no part in writing. And within that system she accumulated a kind of practical power that the legal theory of coverture said she should not have had. Her husband's name was on the property, the contracts were signed in his name, the legal authority was nominally his. But the actual day-to-day governance of everything, the decisions, the negotiations, the strategic thinking, the defence of the walls, that was Margaret. Historians call this kind of informal authority subordinate agency, and I think the phrase is both accurate and slightly unsatisfying, because the word subordinate implies that the real power was elsewhere, and Margaret was borrowing a small amount of it. But when the walls were being broken down at Gresham, and John was in London, and the 12 defenders were looking at a woman in her 20s for leadership in that moment, whose power was it really? The gap between the legal theory and the practical reality of medieval women's lives is one of the most important and most consistently overlooked aspects of this entire history. The law said a wife had no independent authority. The actual world of medieval households, estates, and families could not function without it. Which raises a question I find genuinely interesting to sit with. Did the medieval men who wrote the legal doctrine of coverture, who insisted on women's legal incapacity within marriage, understand what they were doing? I think some of them did. Some of them looked at the situation squarely and decided that the formal structure of male authority was worth preserving, even if in practice women like Margaret Paston were running everything. Because the legal structure had functions beyond the practical. It determined inheritance. It governed disputes. It provided the framework within which conflict could be resolved. And it signaled something about the social order that mattered to people regardless of whether it reflected daily reality. The performance of male authority mattered even when the substance of female authority was carrying the day. There is a detail in the Paston correspondence that I find particularly striking, and I want to end this part of our journey with it. When John Paston died, one of the things his family immediately recognized as crucial to preserve were the letters. Not as emotional keepsakes, though they may have served that purpose too, but as legal evidence. The letters documented property claims, debts, negotiations, transactions. In a world where legal disputes could drag on for decades and turn violent without resolution, paper was protection. John Paston had apparently understood this, and so from very early on had Margaret. She wrote to her eldest son after his father's death, urging him to take care of the documents. Your father set more by his writings and evidence than he did by any of his movable goods. Your father valued his papers more than his possessions, and those papers preserved through more than 500 years of wars, fires, and the general chaos of history are now in the British Library. They are one of the largest and most complete collections of medieval family correspondence in existence. They tell us more about what life inside a medieval marriage actually looked and felt like than almost any other source. And the voice that comes through most clearly, most consistently across more than 100 surviving letters is Margaret's. We have spent this series tracing the arc of what marriage meant for women in the medieval world, from the child brides handled as diplomatic tokens to the practical managers running estates while their husbands theorized about authority from London. We have seen the law. We have seen the theology. We have seen the daily texture. What we have not yet fully explored is the layer underneath all of this, the emotional truth of lives lived inside these arrangements, the grief that was real, and the love that was real, and the daily accumulation of experience that built something in people that the documents can sometimes only gesture toward. And this is exactly where we are going next, into the most intimate and perhaps the most human corner of medieval married life, into what the women themselves, in the rare moments when their own voices come through, said about what it meant to live the life they were given. Somewhere inside the British Library right now, in a climate-controlled room that most people will never see, there is a piece of paper that is nearly 550 years old. It is not grand. It is not a royal decree or a diplomatic treaty or a chronicle of battles. It is a letter, written in a small, careful hand by a young woman in the Norfolk countryside who was worried, genuinely, practically, humanly worried that the man she loved might walk away from her, because her father could not afford a large enough dowry. And somewhere in the middle of it, between the practical concerns and the financial negotiations, she wrote 8 words that changed the English language forever. She called him her right well-beloved Valentine. This is the oldest surviving Valentine's Day letter in English. The year was 1477. The woman was Margery Brews, and the story behind this letter is one of the most unexpected and quietly beautiful pieces of evidence we have about what love, real, ordinary, functional, enduring love actually looked like inside a medieval marriage. Before we get to Margery, I want to spend a moment with the context because it matters enormously. We have spent this entire series tracing the institutional architecture of medieval marriage, the financial structures, the legal frameworks, the church's involvement, the power dynamics, and all of that is real. All of that is documented. All of that shaped the lives of women across every social level in ways that were sometimes liberating and more often constraining. But I have been aware all along of something that documentation tends to flatten the actual emotional texture of the lives being lived inside all of those structures. Because people are not institutions. They're not legal frameworks. They feel things. They want things. They lie awake at night thinking about specific people in specific rooms, and they wake up in the morning and sometimes the first thought that arrives is a person's face rather than a tax assessment or a property dispute. And the question I want to sit inside for this part of our journey is, what did that look like for medieval women? What did the emotional life of a woman inside a medieval marriage actually feel like when the documents let us close enough to see? Back to Margery. She was probably in her late teens or early 20s in February of 1477, the records are not precise. John Paston III, the man she wanted to marry, was 33. He had been looking for a wife for a decade and had pursued at least 10 different potential matches, none of which had resulted in marriage. He needed a wealthy woman. Margery's family were comfortable but not rich. The negotiations had stalled. Her father, Sir Thomas Brews, was not willing to increase the dowry beyond £100, a sum the Pastons considered insufficient. John's older brother, also confusingly named John, was annoyed that his younger sibling had not asked his permission before pursuing the match. Everything was in danger of collapsing, and Margery Brews sat down, or rather she sat with the family scribe, a man named Thomas Keeler, and dictated a letter that she addressed to "my right well-beloved Valentine." She could not write it herself. Almost certainly she could read, but formal letter writing in the 15th century was typically handled by clerks even for educated gentlewomen. So Thomas Keeler took down her words, and somewhere in that act of dictation, Margery's voice comes through younger and more urgent and more nakedly emotional than the formal letter-writing conventions of the time usually permitted. She told John that if he left her, it would break her heart. She told him that she would love him truly over all earthly things. She told him that even if he had a much smaller estate than he currently held, she would still choose him. And then this is the part that strikes me every time I read about this letter she asked him in the same letter that contained all this passion not to share it with anyone. She did not want anyone to see this level of feeling. The emotional directness was private. The financial negotiation was public. Both were present in the same letter dictated to the same scribe, and both were preserved together in the family archive. The letter survived because it was legally useful. It documented the terms of the marriage negotiation. But what it also preserved entirely by accident was a young woman's actual feelings. And those feelings feel startlingly familiar across 5.5 centuries. Her mother, Elizabeth Brews, was also writing to the Pastons at this same time, and her letter is equally fascinating in a different way. Elizabeth wrote to invite John to come for a visit over St. Valentine's Day weekend, and her invitation contains a reference that suggests how the holiday was already beginning to mean something in the cultural imagination of the time. She wrote, "Friday is St. Valentine's Day, and every bird chooseth him a mate." She was invoking Geoffrey Chaucer, who'd written decades earlier that St. Valentine's Day was when birds came together to choose their partners. The idea that February the 14th was connected to romantic love was already circulating in 15th century England, and Elizabeth Brews was using it strategically, setting the emotional scene for the weekend negotiations she hoped would finally resolve the deadlock, a mother engineering a romantic atmosphere to save her daughter's marriage prospects. The tactics of love and the tactics of negotiation woven together so completely that you cannot pull them apart. Now, here is the part that I find most extraordinary. The negotiations worked. John accepted the lower dowry. They married in 1477, and then the story keeps going. In 1484, 7 years after the Valentine letter, several children and countless business letters later, Margery wrote to John again. He was in London on business. The letter contained the usual domestic updates, news about the household, concerns about business matters, notes about family obligations, and then almost at the end, almost as if she could not quite stop herself, she added, she said she thought it was a long time since she had lain in his arms, and she signed the letter, your own sweetheart. 7 years of marriage, multiple pregnancies, the daily grind of running a medieval household, and Margery Brews, who was probably in her late 20s or early 30s by then, was still writing to her husband as her sweetheart and telling him she missed being held by him. This is not a grand love story. There are no dragons, no kingdoms won or lost, no diplomatic triangles involving multiple countries, just a woman and a man in a marriage that had begun in financial negotiation and dowry disputes, who had built something between them that she still wanted badly enough to commit to paper, in a letter that would be read by her husband's household staff and filed in the family archive. She wanted him to know, I want to ask you something, and I mean it genuinely. Does this change how you think about medieval marriage? Because I think it should. Not in a way that erases everything we have discussed. The constraints were real, the legal framework was real, the power imbalances were real. But the Margery Brews letters are a reminder that human beings do not live inside frameworks the way fish live inside tanks. They bring themselves to whatever situation they are in. They make meaning. They form attachments that the surrounding structure did not design and cannot fully explain. Margery and John Paston's marriage began as a financial transaction with emotional overtones. It became over years and children and shared management of a complex household, something that she still described in terms of physical longing and tenderness 7 years in. The structure did not produce that. The people did. And yet, and I want to be careful here because the optimistic reading can slide into something dishonest, Margery Brews was lucky. Not in her feelings, which were her own, but in her circumstances. She found a man who, for whatever mix of calculation and genuine feeling, chose her and stayed. The marriage was difficult to arrange, but once arranged it was stable. She was not isolated from her family. She was not in a household defined by violence or indifference. She had enough resources to function, enough connection to the world to maintain her sense of self. Many women did not have those things, and for them the emotional life of marriage looked very different. The records we have, primarily the records of church courts, property disputes and legal proceedings, are not designed to capture happiness. They capture crisis. They show us the marriages that broke down the women who fled the conflicts that escalated to the point of legal intervention. The quiet marriages, the functional ones, the ones that produced children and harvests and mutual respect without drama, those left almost no trace. This is one of the fundamental challenges of medieval women's history. The evidence is biased toward extremes. We see the very powerful and the very troubled. We see the marriages that made legal history and the marriages that collapsed into violence. The enormous middle ground, the marriages that were neither romantic nor terrible, but simply the texture of a life is mostly invisible. There are small windows. Historians who have read through hundreds of medieval wills, those rare documents in which medieval people sometimes spoke in something closer to their own voices, have found phrases that feel genuinely intimate. A husband leaving his wife everything because she has been his dear companion. A man describing his wife as the person who has managed his affairs better than he could himself. A woman leaving a piece of jewellery to her daughter with the instruction that it was the gift her husband gave her when they were first married, and she wants it to remain in the family. These are small, they are fragments, but they point towards something that the larger legal and institutional history does not always make room for: the possibility that many ordinary medieval marriages contained genuine partnership, genuine tenderness, genuine mutual regard, not because the system encouraged it, but because people are capable of it regardless of the surrounding architecture. There is one more figure I want to bring into this part of the story because she exists right at the intersection of everything we have been discussing: the constraints, the agency, the emotional life, and the way all of these things were braided together in ways the individuals involved did not always get to choose. Her name was Margery Paston. She was the daughter of Margaret Paston, the woman we met in the last section, the one who defended castles while asking for almonds. And Margery Paston did something in 1469 that her family found so unacceptable that her mother effectively disowned her. She married Richard Carler, the family's bailiff, a man employed by the household to manage their estates. Margery and Richard had apparently been in love, or at least in some kind of deep private understanding, for some time. Their marriage was secret, consummated, and then admitted to the family, who were horrified. This was not an appropriate match. A Paston daughter married to a household official was a social catastrophe. It diminished the family's standing. It undermined the entire social logic by which they had built themselves up from ordinary gentry into a family of consequence. Margaret Paston, practical, formidable, deeply intelligent, Margaret tried to have the marriage annulled. She appealed to the Bishop of Norwich. She argued that Margery had not fully understood what she was consenting to. The bishop spoke to Margery directly. He asked her in private what she had said and what she'd meant, and Margery Paston, 19 years old, facing the full weight of her family's disapproval, the authority of a bishop, and the social catastrophe her choice had created, confirmed the marriage, clearly, completely. She knew exactly what she had consented to. The bishop let the marriage stand. Margaret Paston disowned her daughter. Margery and Richard moved out of the family household. They had 3 sons. As far as the records show, the marriage was stable and the couple lived together for the rest of their lives. What I find most striking about Margery Paston's story is not the defiance, though. The defiance was real and costly. It is the bishop's intervention. He spoke to her privately. He asked what she had truly meant. He gave her in that moment something the system was not designed to give: a direct question addressed to her as an individual about her own choices, and she answered it. The same church that had built the entire architecture of consent into medieval marriage law, the same doctrine that said no woman should be married against her free will in this one specific instance, gave a 19-year-old woman the chance to speak for herself, and she did. And the system honoured it. It is a small thing, historically speaking, but it is not nothing. As we come to the end of this part of our journey, I want to offer what I think is the most honest and the most useful frame for everything we have covered so far in this series. Medieval marriage for women was a system built by others, governed by others, and often experienced as something that happened to them rather than something they freely chose. The legal subordination was real. The financial inequity was real. The power imbalances were real. And within all of that, women loved. They managed, they strategized, they grieved, they formed bonds, they longed for specific people from across rooms, they wrote letters asking to be held, they stood their ground before bishops and confirmed choices that cost them everything except the one thing they had decided mattered most. The system did not produce these things, the people did. And that, I think, is the thread that runs through all of it, through every part of this series, through every woman we have met. The system was powerful, but the people inside it were not just inhabitants of the system. They were themselves, insistently, persistently, sometimes defiantly themselves. What we have not yet fully examined is the question of what happened when a woman used the system not just to survive it, but to shape it. When medieval women of extraordinary intelligence and position took everything we have discussed, the legal frameworks, the financial structures, the political uses of marriage, and turned those tools deliberately toward their own ends. The most remarkable example of this in all of medieval history is not one woman, but a series of them, and the thread that connects them runs through some of the most consequential events in European political history. We are almost there. What does it take to break a queen? Not a queen in the fairy tale sense, not a woman who sits on a gilded throne surrounded by ladies in waiting making gracious pronouncements while war happens at a comfortable distance. I mean a real medieval queen, a woman who had navigated the entire system. We have spent this series examining the arranged marriage, the legal subordination, the expectation of silence, the doctrine that her role was to produce heirs and intercede with her husband on behalf of others, not to exercise independent judgment or lead armies. What does it take to break someone like that? The answer in the case of Margaret of Anjou is apparently everything had to go wrong at once. And even then it took nearly 3 decades. She was born in 1430 in a castle on the Moselle River in Lorraine, in what is now northeastern France. Her father was René Duke of Anjou, a man of extraordinary cultural refinement and very little political success, who spent much of her childhood as a prisoner of the Duke of Burgundy, while her mother Isabel governed the duchy and fought wars in his name. Her grandmother on her father's side, Yolande of Aragon, had governed the Duchy of Anjou as regent, while her son was young, had outmanoeuvred the English military presence, and had helped support the claim of the disinherited Charles VII to the French throne. So Margaret grew up surrounded by women who governed, women who led, women who stepped into the political space that their husbands or sons had left vacant and exercised real authority without apology. England, she would discover, had very different ideas about what a queen was for. She arrived in England in April of 1445. She was 15 years old. The marriage had been arranged as part of a truce in the 100 Years' War between England and France, the same exhausting conflict that had been grinding on for more than a century by this point. Margaret brought almost no dowry. Her father was too impoverished from years of warfare to provide one. The English court was already grumbling before she stepped off the boat. Henry VI, her new husband, was 23 years old, already king and already a profoundly problematic monarch. The son of the legendary Henry V, the warrior king who had won at Agincourt and very nearly united England and France under a single crown. Henry VI was everything his father was not. Pious, gentle, unwilling to fight, prone to periods of complete mental incapacitation in which he could not speak, move, or recognize his own wife. Pope Pius II, who presumably was not trying to be cruel, described him as more timorous than a woman utterly devoid of wit or spirit. Margaret had been handed the most powerful title available to a woman in England. She'd also been handed a husband who could not effectively use the power that should have accompanied it. For the first year, she seems to have operated within conventional expectations. She performed the duties of a medieval queen, interceding with her husband on behalf of petitioners, supporting religious foundations, managing her household. She helped establish Queen's College, Cambridge in 1448, a legacy that still exists today, with her heraldic arms incorporated into the college's crest. And then in 1453, 2 things happened in very quick succession that changed everything. Margaret gave birth to a son, Edward of Westminster, born on the 13th of October, the long-awaited heir, and Henry VI collapsed. Not collapsed in the way that tired monarchs sometimes did. He suffered what contemporaries described as a complete breakdown of his faculties. He could not speak, could not recognize, people could not respond to any stimulus. For more than a year, the King of England was effectively absent from the world. He stared into space. He sat without responding. He was present in body and entirely gone in every other sense. Richard, Duke of York, the king's powerful cousin who had been quietly positioning himself for years as the obvious candidate to succeed if Henry died without an heir, was appointed protector. He governed. He made decisions. He distributed patronage. And Margaret, who had just given birth to the heir everyone had been waiting for, found herself in a position that the medieval system had almost no language for. She was the mother of the heir. She was the wife of the king, and the king could not function. What she did next is the reason she's remembered, and the reason she was hated by her enemies for centuries after her death. She fought, not metaphorically, not in the polite behind-the-scenes intercession at the dinner table way that queens were expected to use their influence. Margaret of Anjou built a political faction, assembled allies, deployed the networks of loyalty that ran through the Lancastrian nobility, and over the course of the following decade became the effective leader of one of the two sides in what would become the Wars of the Roses. She raised armies, she directed military campaigns. She negotiated with Scotland, with France, with Burgundy, seeking alliances, seeking troops, seeking any leverage that would allow her to preserve her son's inheritance. Contemporary observers were startled by this. Some admired it. The Duke of Suffolk, one of her early supporters, praised what he called her valiant courage and undaunted spirit. Indeed, the 16th century historian Edward Hall, writing about her later, said she excelled all other as well in beauty and favour as in wit and policy, and was of stomach and courage more like to a man than a woman. There is a particular kind of backhanded compliment that runs through almost every description of a powerful medieval woman more like a man, as if courage and intelligence and strategic thinking were inherently male qualities that could only be attributed to a woman by suggesting she had somehow transcended her own sex. Margaret received this particular observation repeatedly. She would not have found it flattering, but she was probably too busy running a war to care. The war turned against her, multiple times, each time she regrouped. When Henry's forces were defeated at the Battle of Northampton in 1460, Henry himself was captured by the Yorkists. Margaret fled to Scotland with her young son, not to safety to build more support. She negotiated with the Scottish crown. She offered concessions she probably did not fully intend to honour. She was operating with very few resources and was not always in a position to be generous. She won a major Lancastrian victory at the Second Battle of St Albans in 1461, a battle at which her forces recaptured the king from his Yorkist captors. But she was unable to press the advantage. The city of London closed its gates to her, and a few weeks later the Duke of York's son, a brilliant, charismatic young commander who would become Edward IV, swept through with his forces, entered London, and had himself proclaimed king. Henry was deposed. Margaret and her son fled to France. She spent years in exile, negotiating, writing letters, appealing to every court in Europe. She had almost nothing. She was described in some accounts as living in genuine poverty during this period. France was reluctant to help. Scotland had its own problems. The Burgundians changed sides depending on the political weather, and then, in a development that even the most creative novelist would hesitate to invent, she made an alliance with the man who had most recently been her most dangerous enemy. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, known to history as Warwick the Kingmaker, had been the single most powerful supporter of Edward IV. He had helped make Edward king, and then he had fallen out with Edward over a marriage, specifically over the fact that Edward had secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, a widow of relatively modest background, when Warwick had been painstakingly arranging a grand diplomatic marriage for him with a French princess. Warwick was furious. He switched sides. Margaret of Anjou, who had every reason to hate Warwick with the particular passion of someone who had lost everything, partly because of his support for her enemies, sat down with him and made a deal. Their alliance was sealed with a marriage her son Edward and Warwick's daughter Anne Neville. She brought a 15-year-old girl into the negotiation as a political token, in exactly the same way that she herself had been brought to England 25 years earlier. Warwick returned to England. He restored Henry VI to the throne. Henry's readeption, it was called his restoration in October of 1470, and Margaret finally sailed back to England in April of 1471. She arrived on exactly the wrong day, the very same day that she landed in England, April 14th, 1471. Warwick was killed at the Battle of Barnet. Edward IV had fought back. The man she had staked her entire strategy on, the man whose support had made everything possible, was dead before she could join him. She fought on. At Tewkesbury on the 4th of May, 1471, the Lancastrian forces were defeated decisively. Her son Edward, Prince of Wales, the child she had spent 17 years fighting for, was killed in the battle or immediately after. He was 17 years old. Henry VI was murdered in the Tower of London shortly after. He had been a prisoner for so long that his death barely changed anything. Margaret was captured. She remained a prisoner in England for 4 more years until the French King Louis XI paid her ransom, and she was returned to France. She died in 1482. She was 52 years old. She died as a poor relation of the French crown in the region of Anjou, where she'd been born, the woman who'd almost held England together by sheer determination. Shakespeare, who dramatised her story in his history plays, put some of the most powerful and anguished speeches in the English language into her mouth. But he also, reflecting the Yorkist propaganda that had shaped her reputation for generations, called her the she-wolf of France, a beast, not a woman, something monstrous. The label has stuck in some imaginations, but I think it reveals more about the people applying it than about Margaret herself. She was not a monster. She was a woman who had been placed in an impossible situation, married to a king who could not function, mother to an heir who needed protecting, queen of a country that had no legal framework for what she was being asked to do, and she had done it anyway. She had used every tool available to her: marriage alliances, diplomatic networks, military command, sheer relentless perseverance. She had failed ultimately, but she'd made the failure a genuine contest, not a foregone conclusion. And the men who called her a she-wolf were, I think, doing what people have often done when confronted with a woman who operates at a scale the world told her she was not supposed to occupy. They reach for an insult that made her less human, rather than acknowledge that she was formidably uncomfortably competent. There is a question I want to put to you, and I genuinely think it is worth sitting with. If Margaret of Anjou had been born into a different body, if everything that was her intelligence, her determination, her strategic thinking, her capacity for loyalty and her capacity for ruthlessness had arrived in a male person of comparable rank, would she have been called a king worth admiring? Would she have been compared to Henry V, who was celebrated for his military campaigns, his alliances, his willingness to press a claim through years of setback? I think the answer is probably yes. And I think the fact that the same qualities in a woman produced the she-wolf label, rather than the warrior king label, tells us something important about how medieval society understood what it meant for a woman to exercise the full range of human capacity. Margaret of Anjou represents perhaps the most extreme version of something we have seen in varying degrees throughout this entire series: A woman taking the institution of marriage, the title. It conferred the alliances it generated, the position it created, and using those things as the foundation for something the institution itself was never designed to support. She was a queen because of a marriage. Everything else she became, she built herself. And that story, the story of what women built from the narrow materials the world handed them, is the thread that has run through every part of this journey. We are almost at the end. And the last part of this story is perhaps the most moving of all, because it is not about power or warfare or legal frameworks. It is about what endured underneath all of those things, what women kept, what they passed on, through the elaborate financial negotiations of the medieval dowry system, where a woman's worth was calculated in land and currency before she was old enough to understand what was being traded. Through the extraordinary legal doctrine that made a wife disappear from the record the moment she said her vows. Through the Church's meticulous, sometimes startling calendar of permission and prohibition. Through the courts where women argued for the right to live apart from husbands who were destroying them. Through the unexpected freedom that arrived with widowhood and the remarkable women who used that freedom to reshape the world around them. Through Isabella of Valois, who was 7 years old when she arrived in England with her dolls packed alongside her jewels. Through Margaret Paston requesting crossbows and almonds in the same letter. Through Margery Brews whispering to a scribe the words that became the oldest valentine in the English language. And through Margaret of Anjou, the she-wolf, the queen who fought for 17 years with nothing but determination and intelligence, and the title a marriage had given her. We have walked through all of that. And now at the end of this journey I want to share what I think is the most important thing I have come to understand about what marriage meant for women in the medieval world. The records are not neutral, they never are. Most of what survives from medieval history was written by men preserved by men, and organised according to categories that men found interesting or useful. Legal disputes, property transactions, military campaigns, the decisions of courts, the pronouncements of the church. Women appear in these records almost entirely in relation to the men around them, as daughters being transferred, as wives being governed, as widows seeking their thirds, as litigants in church courts describing harm in the specific legal language required to qualify for relief. Their interior lives, what they thought, what they wanted, what they feared, what they hoped for in the ordinary moments of an ordinary day, almost never appear directly. And yet when you read carefully, when you look at the edges of the documents rather than their centres, something begins to emerge. A man named Oliver Leader, writing his will in the late 15th century, described himself as deeply sorry that for his wife's wise and womanly governance and most loving and honest behaviour towards me at all times, since our marriage, I have not 10 times so much to give unto her. He was dying, and he wanted the record to show that he knew what she had given him and he could never repay it. A woman named Isabel de Beauchamp, Countess of Warwick, directing the construction of her tomb, asked that her image be carved all naked, not dressed in the robes of her husband's family, not adorned with his symbols, but herself bare and human, with her own family's arms held aloft by 2 griffins on either side, a statement made in stone that her identity had never been entirely subsumed in his. Hundreds of medieval wills, when historians have looked closely at their language, contain small phrases of extraordinary tenderness. My dear companion, my beloved partner, the one who has managed my affairs more wisely than I could myself. These are not the formal words of legal contracts. They are the words of people who lived alongside other people for years and decades, and were trying in the compressed language of a will to say something true about what that had meant. Here is what I have come to believe about medieval marriage after everything we've examined together. It was a system that was genuinely unjust to women in ways that were documented, structural, and sometimes devastating. The legal framework erased them. The financial structure treated them as assets. The institutional church imposed constraints on their bodies and their choices that no equivalent institution imposed on men. The gap between what the law permitted and what required for relief was wide enough that women who were being harmed could find no formal exit. All of that is true, and it is also true that inside that system love grew, tenderness grew, partnership grew, not because the system encouraged any of those things, but because human beings placed in proximity to each other, sharing the same difficulties and seasons and children and losses, tend to build bonds that cannot be fully explained by the legal or financial architecture surrounding them. The medieval woman who managed her husband's estates while he was at court was not simply fulfilling a function. She was also building competence, authority, identity. She was becoming someone, and the husband who came home and trusted her judgment, who left lists of instructions because he knew she would handle them, was in some functional sense treating her as a partner, regardless of what the law said. The woman who wrote, "My heart bids me evermore to love you truly over all earthly things," was not writing in defiance of the system. She was writing within it, using the only tools available to her language emotion, the willingness to be seen to assert something. The system had no category for that she was a person who felt things, and those things mattered, and she wanted him to know. What strikes me most sitting with all of this history is the persistence of human agency in the narrowest of spaces. The medieval world built an elaborate architecture designed to keep women in a specific place, and women kept finding the cracks. Not always, not reliably, often at enormous personal cost, but with a consistency that across 500 years of documented history becomes impossible to attribute to coincidence. They used consent law when it served them. They used church courts when they could. They used the skills they developed managing their husbands' households to manage their own estates once those husbands were gone. They used the title that marriage gave them to build political networks the marriage itself had never intended to create. They used letters dictated to scribes filed in legal archives for practical reasons to say things that the archive was not designed to preserve. I love you. I miss being held by you. I am still here. I am still myself. I want to end with something that I think captures the complexity of all of this better than any legal document or official history can. There is a poem. It is very old, probably from the 10th century, written in Old English thought by many scholars to have been composed by a woman. It is called The Wife's Lament. We do not know who wrote it. We do not know the specific circumstances that produced it. What we have is a voice preserved across more than 1,000 years, speaking from inside a situation of loss and constraint and separation. The poem's speaker has been separated from her husband through some conflict or exile. The details are deliberately vague. She's living alone in a dwelling under an oak tree underground. She speaks of the longing for someone she loved and lost. She speaks of the gap between what was and what is. The poem ends without resolution. There is no rescue, no reunion, no closing of the wound. There is just the voice still speaking, still insisting on the reality of what was felt. That voice, unresolved and unsilenced, is the thread that runs through everything we have discussed tonight. The medieval world tried very hard to make women into categories: daughter, wife, widow, queen, villain, saint. And women kept insisting in ways large and small and sometimes barely audible across the centuries on being something more complicated than any category. On being themselves. Think about everything we have covered. A child bride who arrived in a foreign country with her dolls in her trousseau and refused when widowed at 10 to be handed to the next king. A legal scholar writing in the 12th century that no woman should be married against her free will, and meaning it, even if the gap between the law and the reality remained enormous. A young woman in Norfolk dictating a letter to a scribe and calling the man she loved her Valentine the first time that word ever appeared in the English language in that sense. A widow in Suffolk managing estates across several counties, sending men to debtor's prison, corresponding with kings living the fullest version of herself she had ever been permitted to inhabit. A queen refusing to stop fighting for 17 years, never winning, never stopping. None of these women had an easy time of it. None of them lived in a world built for their flourishing, but all of them in ways that range from the quietly personal to the historically transformative found something to hold on to, something to insist on, some version of themselves that the system could not quite erase. That, I think, is what marriage meant for women in the medieval world. Not just the law, not just the financial transaction, not just the church's elaborate calendar of permission and prohibition. It meant all of those things, yes, but it also meant what human beings always make of the structures around them when they have enough life and enough stubbornness and enough love, something that the structure itself never fully intended and could never completely account for. We've been on quite a journey tonight. 12 parts across hours and centuries and countries, through courts and castles and manor houses, and the pages of documents that were never meant to tell this story, but tell it anyway if you know how to look. If any of this has made you see the medieval world differently, if it has given you a more complex picture of what it meant to be a woman inside a marriage that was not designed for your benefit, and yet to live a life of genuine substance within it, then I am glad we made this journey together. I want to hear from you. What surprised you the most? Was it the consent doctrine that created the world's most elaborate loophole? Was it Margery Paston asking for poleaxes and almonds in the same letter? Was it the Valentine that has survived 5.5 centuries in the British Library? Tell me in the comments, because your reactions are genuinely one of the things I find most interesting about making these videos. And if you have been sleeping through parts of this honestly, that is completely fine. That is exactly what this channel is for. You can always listen again. If this series has resonated with you, please consider sharing it with someone you think would find it interesting. Every person who finds this channel finds it because someone passed it along, and I am genuinely grateful for every one of you who is here. The next story we're going to explore is equally human, equally complex, and equally full of people who were given a narrow version of what their lives were supposed to look like, and found ways to live something larger. I will see you there. Sleep well wherever you are, and thank you for listening.